Assalamualaikum everyone. Welcome to the Ideas Book Talk series. Um, मेरा नाम मरियम खान है और मैं रिसर्च फेलो हूँ at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives, which is a think tank based here in Lahore. और इस सीरीज़ के मेज़बान हस्तो-नीस्त हैं एंड आई थिंक हस्तो-नीस्त नहीं है तो ये बुक टॉक सीरीज़ भी नहीं। एंड ये भी मैं कहना चाहूँगी कि ये जो सीरीज़ है ये आइडियाज़ और बज़्म-ए-आलम के तावन से है, सो इट्स नॉट जस्ट एन आइडियाज़ बुक टॉक। और बज़्म-ए-आलम का जो तारुफ़ है वो इस ऑडियंस में प्रॉब्ली नेसेसरी नहीं है, लेकिन मैं ये कहना चाहूँगी कि बिकॉज़ बज़्म-ए-आलम वर्क्स ऑन एंड प्रमोट्स इंटरफेथ एंड इंटरकल्चरल हार्मनी, तो हमारी कोशिश ये होती है कि हम हर बुक टॉक के एक सेगमेंट में कम से कम इन्हीं थीम्स पर गुफ्तगू कर सकें। तो हम कोशिश ये करेंगे कि हम कल्चरल कोहीजन, सोशल क्लीवेजेस, पॉलिटिकल क्लीवेजेस की जो बात है उनको किसी तरह डायरेक्ट कॉन्वर्सेशन में लाएं आज की बुक टॉक में, और वो विल डू दैट इन द लास्ट सेगमेंट. So with that, please join me in welcoming today's very distinguished speaker, Dr. Yasser Kureshi, who is a departmental lecturer in South Asian Studies in the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies at the University of इनका जो काम है वो एक बड़ी दिलचस्प इंटरसेक्शन पे है, पॉलिटिकल साइंस और पब्लिक लॉ की इंटरसेक्शन है, पब्लिक लॉ जिसको हम कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल लॉ भी कहते हैं. And his research looks at the politics of unelected state institutions outside democratic contexts. In particular, he studies the military and the judiciary. और आज की जो उनकी जो किताब है वो बेसिकली जुडिशल मिलिट्री रिलेशंस पे है, एंड their impact on constitutional configurations and democratic outcomes, especially in authoritarian context like Pakistan. लेकिन इनका काम और ममालिक पे भी है. So he doesn't just work on constitutionalism in Pakistan, he does comparative constitutionalism. So इसी किताब में for instance पाकिस्तान को उन्होंने एज अ केस स्टडी प्रेजेंट किया है, लेकिन फिर साथ साथ उन्होंने उस केस को एक तरह से टेस्ट भी किया है in comparison to jurisdictions like Turkey, Egypt, Nigeria, Tunisia. And other broad categories of his research include judicial populism, legitimation of military regimes, comparative courts, formation of legal cultures, and South Asian law and politics. आज की बुक का नाम है सीकिंग सुप्रीमेसी, द परसूट ऑफ जुडिशल पावर इन पाकिस्तान. और ये जो किताब है ये डॉक्टर कुरैशी की डॉक्टरल डिसर्टेशन पे बेस्ड है, जिसको एक एडवर्ड एस कॉर्विन अवार्ड मिला था फॉर द बेस्ट डिसर्टेशन इन पब्लिक लॉ बाय द अमेरिकन पॉलिटिकल साइंस एसोसिएशन इन 2015. So this is an award-winning dissertation turned into a book published in 2022 by the Cambridge University Press. So welcome, Dr. Kureshi, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for such a flattering introduction also, and thank you so much.
Well, I think it's a very modest introduction. Before we go into the book, into the meat of the book, मैं एक बड़ा जो है सवाल उठाना चाहूँगी या आपका एक कमेंट इनवाइट करना चाहूँगी. वो एक ऐसी थीम है जो आई थिंक ऑल ऑफ अस वांट टू नो, स्पेशली जो रिसर्चर्स हैं या जो लीगल कमेंट्री में इंटरेस्टेड हैं, कि एक हमारी लीगल रिसर्च का एक रिवायती या कन्वेंशनल एक फ्रेमवर्क या तरीका होता है टू लुक एट लॉ थ्रू जजमेंट. तो आप केसेस पढ़ते हैं, जजमेंट्स पढ़ते हैं, डॉक्ट्रिन को देखते हैं, आप देखते हैं प्रेसिडेंट किस तरह फॉर्म हो रहा है, जजेस लॉ को किस तरह इंटरप्रेट कर रहे हैं, उनकी लीगल रीजनिंग क्या है. और ये एक डॉक्ट्राइनल लॉ का मेथड है जो कि हमेशा से रहा है, और पाकिस्तान में आई थिंक हमारे कॉन्टेक्स्ट में अभी भी ये एक डोमिनेंट मेथड है लीगल रिसर्च. इसके अलावा फिर अगर आप कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन या कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल हिस्ट्री की तरफ चले जाएं तो एक बहुत जाना पहचाना नाम है जो आई थिंक हर मेजर लीगल रिसर्च के काम पे में cited है वो हामिद, ठीक है, उनकी कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल हिस्ट्री ऑफ पाकिस्तान, उनकी जुडिशल हिस्ट्री, दो बहुत अहम किताबें हैं। और उसका जो मेथड है वो ये है कि एक बेसिक आपकी पॉलिटिकल टाइमलाइन या क्रोनोलॉजी होती है, उसको बयान किया जाता है एज हिस्ट्री, अमेलगमेशन ऑफ फैक्ट। तो एक टाइमलाइन चल रही है कि 47 में ये हुआ, गवर्नमेंट क्या एक्ट था, फिर पॉलिटिकल स्फेयर में ये हुआ, फिर कू हुआ, फिर जुडिशरी ने ये जजमेंट दी, फिर नेक्स्ट साइकिल में जुडिशरी ने वो ओवरटर्न की जूरिस्प्रूडेंस, फिर से कू हुआ, एक्सेट्रा एक्सेट्रा। और आपको ये फीलिंग होगी कि वो हिस्ट्री इज़ ऑन अ सिक्लिकल लूप, एक ऐसा लूप है जिसको कहा जाता है कि बड़ी एक चेकर्ड हिस्ट्री है, उसके अंदर एक एक किस्म की ट्रैजिक कॉनोटेशन है कि कोई चीज़ चेंज नहीं हो रही, वही चीज़, वही डायनामिक जो है वो दोहराया। बट इंटरेस्टिंगली जब मैंने डॉक्टर कुरैशी की किताब पढ़ी तो मुझे रियलाइज़ हुआ कि लीगल रिसर्च इज़ नॉट जस्ट अबाउट टाइमलाइंस एंड हिस्टोरिकल, और ये जो आप लूप देख रहे हैं ये इनफैक्ट लूप नहीं है। ये जो ट्रैजेक्टरी है इसके नीचे एक बहुत गहरा सोशल चेंज है, एक सोशल ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन है, और उस सोशल ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन को देखे बगैर और एनालाइज किए बगैर हम ब्रॉडर पॉलिटिकल चेंज को नहीं समझ, क्योंकि वो पॉलिटिकल चेंज जो आपको ऊपर से नज़र आ रहा है वो बहुत सुपरफिशियल है, उसके नीचे एक बहुत गहरा सोसाइटल चेंज। एंड दिस मेथड इज़ व्हाट वी रिफर टू एज सोशियो लीगल रिसर्च, कि लॉ और सोसाइटी का क्या नेक्सस है, उनका क्या जो सो ये जो किताब है उसकी मेरे नज़दीक सबसे नुमायाँ बात ये है कि इट्स अ सोशियो लीगल मेथड विच इज़ बीइंग यूज्ड टू टेल द स्टोरी ऑफ how judges think, how they interpret and apply the law, and what that means for their relationship with the military and vice versa, and उसकी social underpinnings क्या है। So थोड़ा सा अगर आप हमें एज अ प्रिलिमिनरी बताएं कि आप आपकी अपनी थिंकिंग में व्हाट इज सोशियो लीगल रिसर्च, व्हाई वर यू मोटिवेटेड टू यूज दिस मेथड, and as part of this method you've used an entire gamut of so many diverse sources, उसके अंदर judgments भी हैं, उसके अंदर interviews भी हैं, उसके अंदर बहुत सी चीज़ें हैं जो आप इकट्ठी लेकर आते हैं। So if you could say something so that we can also do.
Thank you, Maryam. And thank you so much, first of all, for having me here. This is a real privilege to be able to sit here and talk about my book. And I think Maryam, the way you've laid out the sort of the methodology and the sort of difference between doctrinal research and socio-legal research really, I think, resonates with my own sort of own motivations and thinking as to how I wanted to write this book. Probably explaining it better than I could in some ways. But I'd like to talking a little bit about that. So the idea of the basically look so from a very personal motivation, right? Like if you're Pakistani and I was an undergrad in what the 2004 to 2008 period, right? And that's the first thing the most prominent thing that happens in our politics in that period is the lawyers' movement, is the fall of the Iftikhar Chaudhry's suspension, the fall of General Musharraf, right? Now, when your first introduction to looking at the law is this social movement of different sorts, right? It's very hard not to think and talk about the law and the courts and judgment without thinking about society, given the very visible way in which groups in society were putting pressure on the courts, on the institutions, on the state to act in particular ways, to take particular actions, to adopt different stances vis-a-vis each other, right? So the lawyers' movement really makes it, if you've witnessed the lawyers' movement, it's impossible to then go back and then say, I will read judgments as if they are entirely isolated and cut off from what's happening in society, when it had such a profoundly obvious impact on what the courts were doing at the time and what the political system as a whole was doing at the time, for better or for worse, right? The impact was evident. So I think for that reason, it's, as a Pakistani, I think there's a natural motivation to think about courts and judges and judgments in a way that it is embedded and connected to the society that's producing those courts, those judges, and that is impacted and shaped by those courts and those judges. So hence, I think socio-legal research made obvious sense when you took the Pakistani case, and I think in some ways, but I think most courts should be studied in this way, along with I think there's more to learn about cases than when you study them as parts of socio-political processes rather than as divorced from them or separate from them. So that's kind of was the motive starting point. I think just being witness to that, that so many of us were, made us maybe think about, want to think and write about the courts and the judges in that way. And when I think about socio-legal research, and so in many ways, like the point of the book is really looking at the way the judiciary's approach to the military has shifted in many ways over time. But the story that I seek to tell by doing that is one not just of the, how has the judiciary dealt with the military over time? How has it changed? But what does it tell about how the judiciary has changed, right? What has changed within the institution about why it approaches the law in different ways, why it approaches the military in different ways, how is that, and why it's approached civilian institutions in different ways as well over time, right? So it's really a story about the way the courts have just, in a nutshell, become so much more ambitious, right? Politically ambitious over the last few decades, and what is the roots of that ambition. Now, you cannot find the roots of that ambition just by reading one judgment after the other. You have to study the institution. You have to study the institution's relationship to the rest of society and the state, and how those relationships have evolved and changed the institution to make it this more ambitious, confrontational, and institution that we've seen, particularly in the last 20 years. So, in terms of methods, as you mentioned, right, so I tried to use a bunch of different methods, right? So I collected a lot of court judgments, right? I'd use the focal point to trace trends in jurisprudence over time and looking at court judgments by relating to the military in different ways over the last few decades. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about how I talked about those judgments and interpreted them. But I think at all times, what I also wanted to do was, in every judgment, I wanted to look at the judges, right? So not just look at the language of the law, but the people making those judgments. What was their, what were their socio-economic, political backgrounds? How do we think that informed the kind of judgments they were making, right? And then trying to embed them in broader socio-political cleavages, that how those have changed over time in society, and that impacted the courts that emerged from that, right? So thinking about, how, you had more and more, in an earlier era, you had judges more coming from the civil service, then judges coming from the legal profession, how that change shapes the way these judges approach their judgments, approach the law, approach their role, right? And Usme, I think one of the things that I think is very interesting to read in judgments, therefore, is not just the decision, not even just the justification for the decision itself, but in it, how the court decides that this is something that they should be intervening in or not intervening in, right? The maintainability part or the choice, right? Because in there's a lot of language in these judgments about what the court think they should be doing and ought to be doing and why they should do it, right? And I think that often is one of the most interesting parts of the judgment, more than just अच्छा आपने फैसला दिया इनके खिलाफ या इनके खिलाफ, but why do you think you should give that kind of judgment at all, right? And I think that studying those parts of judgments, connecting them to the judges who are making those sorts of judgments and those calls and those justifications, I think was a really interesting way to embed the judgments into the networks that are producing those judges, and thinking about those changes have informed the judgments produced by the judges that emerge in the court through those changes. I can talk more about all that as we go forward.
लेकिन हमें सिर्फ बताएं कि अंदाज़न आपने कितनी जजमेंट्स पढ़ी?
So I would say at least about, I'd say about 1,200 judgments. I'd say about 800 went into my data set specifically on the military judgments. But then obviously you can't just be like, the military judgments are not happening in isolation from, the al-jihads or the public interest litigation, etc. So then overall about 1,200 to 1,250 judgments probably I had to read, and 800 of them I put into my sort of data set of military specific judgments.
Very 60s onwards.
Yeah, from the I think so. Judgments, I was reading 60s onwards, but the data set is specifically 73 onwards, because I sort of did it under the 73 constitutional framework onwards.
Yeah. और आपने कितने lawyers को interview किया?
It was about 130 lawyers and judges.
Lawyers and judges.
Yes.
Any politicians?
Yes, So okay, that's right. Wrong. 120 lawyers and judges, about 15 to 20 politicians. Yeah, I would say. Some interviews more useful than the others, of course, and that's always the case. But yeah, and then some would do multiple rounds and so on and so forth.
ٹھیک ہے. سو دس از این ایگزامپل آف امپیریکل ریسرچ کہ آپ ایکچولی فیلڈ میں جاتے ہیں اور آپ لوگوں سے انگیج کرتے ہیں آرکائیول مٹیریل اور کیس لاء کو علیحدہ رکھتے ہوئے, اور پھر آپ ان ساری چیزوں کو ٹرائنگولیٹ کرتے ہیں. سو دس از فینٹاسٹک. اینڈ آپ کا بڑا سوال جو ہے وہ بیسکلی سب سے اہم جو آپ کا کور کویسچن ہے وہ یہ ہے کہ پاکستان کی جوڈیشری اگر آپ 50s اور 60s میں دیکھیں تو وہ آپ کو براڈ ٹرینڈز یہ نظر آتے ہیں کہ وہ بہت سبسروینٹ ہے یا کم از کم ایک ایز اے کولیبوریٹر ایکٹ کرتی ہے ٹو دا ایگزیکٹو اینڈ ٹپکلی ٹو دا ملٹری ایگزیکٹو بیکاز ملٹری بیوروکریسی ڈومیننٹ ہے. اور اس زمانے میں کہا جاتا تھا کہ the courts are the bedfellows of the military. They are the junior partner of the military, right? So وہ ایک extension تھے of your executive power جو کہ آپ کا ایک colonial framework تھا. So آپ کا سوال یہ ہے کہ ہم کیوں یہ shift دیکھ رہے ہیں کہ عدلیہ جو ہے وہ as a collaborator شروع ہوتی ہے اور پھر وہ اس پوائنٹ پہ آ جاتی ہے steadily with some setbacks کہ وہ اب کنفرنٹ کر رہی ہے پاکستان کی ملٹری کو ڈائریکٹلی کنفرنٹ کر رہی ہے. اینڈ اس کا مطلب یہ ڈائریکٹلی کس طرح کنفرنٹ کر رہی ہے کہ جو ملٹری کے پریروگیٹیوز ہیں یعنی جو ان کے آئی تھنک کوئی ریزرو ڈومینز آپ کہیں گے یا جو ملٹری اپنے لیے پاور کلیم کرتی ہے تو اس کے ان کے حوالے سے وہ کس طرح سے ملٹری کو پش بیک یا چیلنج کرتی ہے. تو یہ ایک بڑی سی آرک ہے آپ دیکھیں جو انہوں نے ڈرا کی ہے فرام the 60s all the way to the present moment, which is why he's looked at so many judgments and all of that. And آپ نے بات کی longitudinal یا پروسیس ٹریسنگ کی, میننگ کہ وہ سارے جو ہیں وہ کوڈ کر کے جو آپ کا ڈیٹا سیٹ ہے اس میں پھر آپ براڈ ٹرینڈز نکالتے ہیں, رائٹ. کچھ بتائیں گے کہ یہ آپ نے 3 جو ملٹری پریروگیٹیوز دیکھے ہیں جہاں پہ وہ کلیم کرتے ہیں ایک ڈومیننٹ یا سپیریئر پوزیشن کی سیکیورٹی جو ہے وہ ہماری جورسڈکشن ہے یا اکنامک پالیسی ہے, رائٹ, یا پولیٹیکل اینڈ پالیسی میکنگ ہے. یہ 3 براڈ کیٹیگریز آپ ہمارے لیے ڈراپ کرتے ہیں. تو تھوڑا سا بتائیں کہ جب آپ نے یہ ساری ججمنٹس دیکھی ہیں اور لوگوں سے بات کی اوور دس ویری لانگ ہسٹوریکل آرک, تو آپ کے براڈ ٹرینڈز کیا آپ کو نظر آئے ہیں؟ 2-3 کوئی موٹے موٹے جو ٹرینڈز آپ کو نظر آئے.
بالکل, ایبسلیوٹلی. تو جو ہے the military prerogatives as you laid out very well کہ یہ 3 طرح کے تھے, right. I look at the idea کہ ایک تو military's control over its own institution and its operations and its security work, right. وہ اس کی core جو prerogative ہے, this is what we do and nobody else does. That's sort of one set of interests that they have. The other is کہ economic prerogative, کہ ہماری military is one that has a lot of economic interests, whether it is simply budgets to going to things like Fauji Foundation, to cantonments, to DHAs, all of that, right? The broad commercial real estate empire. And then the third is the military has the prerogative to insert itself into governance, into politics, into policy making, right from being like we can take over the government to be saying we can take over engage in different areas of policy making in the state. So the point was to see the courts, how do they deal with, like when we want to observe how the court deals with the military over time, it's not enough کہ ہم صرف اچھا یہ 4 coup cases تھے, یہ 4 coup cases میں کیا differences نظر آئے, State versus Doso, Nusrat Bhutto versus this and Zafari Shah. I mean they're interesting to study on their own as well, مگر اسی سے آپ کو پورا story نہیں نظر آتی ہے. You need to be able to look at all of these different areas of interest of the military and think of how the judiciary is dealing with them over time. So what I find is first, or cumulatively, you will see a gradual, though unsteady, increase in the amount of cases more broadly in which the judiciary is more willing to challenge the military, right, in some way or form. But I think more interesting than that is to see what issues they're more willing to challenge them on. So if we think about where the military sees as its core set of interests, as so politics and policy making, they do insert themselves a lot, right? But the economic interests and the security interests are even closer to their heart because that's sort of what they institutionally run on, right? So when the courts challenge them on political issues, that's obviously confrontational enough. But when they are going after them, or not going after them, but sort of making judgments against their interests on economic issues, or on the economic interest, or even more so on their security interests, that would be an even more even clearer evidence that there is a court that is more willing to confront military power than before. And I think that's what I found gradually over particularly the 90s and 2000s. You see the courts challenging not just the military sort of willingness to engage in politics, but also engaging in sort of its economic interest, particularly its economic. In fact, that's I think the place where you see the most clear arc of increased contestation of the military, which is courts increasingly getting involved in challenging sort of the military's different economic prerogatives regarding the commercial empire, real estate empire, etc. Now, this is not to say that suddenly everything the military does is being confronted by the court in any way. It's just there's a relative change or increase over time in this area of the military's economic interest that I think speaks more broadly to the judiciary's greater willingness to engage in these areas of jurisprudence and areas of and judicialize these issues in a way they were more cautious on doing before, right? And I think that's what's interesting to observe. So there is this gradual but significant change towards taking on more and more risky cases vis-a-vis the military and confronting them in that way more and more.
और आप फिर समझाते हैं कि इट्स नॉट कि दूसरों ने ये पॉइंट आउट नहीं किया कि जुडिशरी जो है वो ऑब्वियसली ज़्यादा असर्टिव हो गई है टुवर्ड्स द मिलिट्री, लेकिन जो मौजूदा एक्सप्लेनेटरी फ्रेमवर्क्स हैं उनसे हट के इनका फ्रेमवर्क है। ऑफ कोर्स वो जो मौजूदा फ्रेमवर्क्स हैं उन पे आप थोड़ा सा हमें बताएंगे कि आप कहते हैं कि अच्छा ठीक है ये सारी चीज़ें जो हैं इम्पॉर्टेंट हैं कि लीगल डॉक्ट्रिन या लीगल इंटरप्रिटेशन फ़र्क तरीके से हो रही है, डेफिनेटली ठीक है जी। एटीट्यूड्स और पॉलिसी प्रेफरेंसेस डेफिनेटली जजेस के चेंज हुए हैं ओवर टाइम, ठीक है जी। आपकी सियासी इन्वायरमेंट चेंज हुई है, फ्रैगमेंट हुई है। 90s में फॉर इंस्टेंस ऑफ कोर्स आपकी पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज आई, मल्टी पार्टी सिस्टम इनिशिएट हुआ और उस ज़माने में बहुत कॉन्टेस्टेशन थी। जुडिशरी, मिलिट्री, पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज़ की एक ट्रायंगुलर सॉर्ट ऑफ कॉन्टेस्टेशन थी और कुछ लोगों का कहना है कि वो जो एक पॉलिटिकल फ्रैगमेंटेशन थी उस वक्त, उसकी वजह से जुडिशरी को ज़्यादा स्पेस मिल गई असर्ट करने के लिए अपने आप को। और आई थिंक आई एम ऑल्सो वन ऑफ द पीपल हु मेक्स दैट आर्ग्यूमेंट। डॉक्टर कुरैशी इज बेसिकली destroyed and dismissed my argument, I also want to say, but very ably and very persuasively। तो उनका ये कहना है कि ज़रूर वो एक फैक्टर है, फ्रैगमेंटेशन एक फैक्टर है, लेकिन उसके अलावा भी और बहुत सी वजूहात हैं और एक ख़ास तौर पे एक वजह है जिसको ये कहते हैं, जिसका जो इन्होंने टर्म इस्तेमाल की है वो है जुडिशल ऑडियंसेस फ्रेमवर्क। और थोड़ा सा आप बताएंगे कि एग्जिस्टिंग जो एक्सप्लेनेटरी फ्रेमवर्क्स हैं वो क्यों नहीं, व्हाई डोंट दे डू जस्टिस टू एक्सप्लेनिंग व्हाट हैज़ हैपेंड एंड व्हाट इज़ दिस ऑडियंसेस फ्रेमवर्क जो आप ऑल्टरनेटिव प्रेजेंट कर रहे हैं और इसका क्या मायने?
So thank you. So first of all, I have, as you said, I have certainly not dismissed the political fragmentation. बस मैं ये कह रहा था कि it does tell us some of the story, but not the whole story. And it's important to say, even my theory doesn't tell the whole story. It tells another part of the story that needs to be told alongside that part of the story. You learn to get a lot more humble with your writing as you go along, and you realize that, dissertation likhte, you're like, everyone's wrong and I'm right. And after a while, you write the book. And then you, after you write the book and you read everyone else's work again, you realize, you were advocating for yourself so strongly before, but everybody has a point, and sometimes it's worth acknowledging that. And I've learned a lot from.
No, I was just being provocative.
No, but it's important for my own, I think it's an important part of the learning process as an academic. So I always like to state that. I think basically the point is that when we think about we are seeing judges today, in the court, just the kind of issues they feel they can weigh in on, the kind of language they use, the kind of policy interests they present, etc. There's a marked change from the 50s and 60s compared to today in that context, right? And I think just simply observing the change in the preferences, in the way these judges understand what their role in the system is, in the way they understand what their policy interests are, etc. Trying to just say, "Bas change hui hai," is not enough. We need to understand why that change has happened. And I think my point about the political fragmentation is the theory is, as you said, in moments of greater political fragmentation, when different institutions don't dominate the political system as much, that gives space to the judiciary to assert itself more, right? And I certainly think that in the 90s, that fragmentation enabled the judiciary to assert itself more in ways that it never fully it didn't fully walk back from after. So it's critically important to understand how the 90s shaped the courts. But I also think that there are moments when there wasn't political fragmentation, when the judiciary still asserted itself, that cannot be explained just by political fragmentation, right? Or asserted itself relatively more than previous eras, right? So, for example, even if we go back, right, why did the courts assert themselves relatively more in the late 70s and the early period of Zia ul-Haq, at least the high courts, than they did in this, in the years preceding, in the Ayub Khan's period, etc.? How do you understand that? That's certainly not a very politically fragmented period, early Zia ul-Haq's regime, right? Yet you see some really interesting and important challenges by the judiciary at that time. And then similarly in the 2000s, even when you see the courts on political issues walking back their interventions on the military, you see them kind of moving forward and continuing to engage and expand their jurisdiction over particularly issues like the economic interests of the military, etc., which ultimately then comes together with into the broader clash that we see between the Musharraf regime and the Iftikhar Chaudhry court. I mean, not to personalize it, but that period of the court in 2006, 2007. So therefore, my argument was that there's something happening institutionally that isn't captured over time and longitude, that can't be just captured by the up and downs of political power in the country and its variation. Although that is obviously, you can't understand the judiciary without understanding that, right? And I think for me, that was that the judiciary as to understand the way the courts, the preferences and the ideologies that courts hold hold dear or that inform their judgments and their behavior are really shaped by a broader set of institutional relationships that judiciary has with institutions or networks or organizations which these judges seek to build a reputation. So my point was that judges aren't just seeking to expand their authority for the sake of it, or seeking to challenge for make certain decisions because of the black letter law as it stands, but they're also deeply concerned about their reputation. And the reputation is important to them for both material and non-material interests. Yani ki hamari career to further our careers, that we build our reputation, but also because we like it when people like us, right? Judges are people, right? And they're like, if people in our networks think we're good at our job, we feel good about that, right? And I think that goes to, it's sort of obvious, but it's something more important than I think maybe a purely political science framework and a lot of what I study would consider adequately, right? So for these multiple interests, I think judges, audiences, what mattered was which audiences judges cared, which institutions, networks, or associations that judges care most about their reputation with. And that's which were the institutions and networks that judges considered as their most important audiences, right? For their judgments, for their actions, for their behavior. And if we want to understand how a particular set of ideas becomes entrenched and institutionalized in the judiciary, we want to see which audiences are most important at a given time for the judiciary, shaping the way in which the judges think, if we, think about building their reputation, consolidating their reputation, right? So the idea is, if you think, you want to connect how judges think about building their reputation, who they want to build their reputation with, and how their judgments will be shaped by that pursuit of reputation with those key audiences, right? And I think that was my sort of broader thinking, that if we want to understand the change we've seen over time, we should be looking at the change in audiences that we've seen over time with the judiciary and how that has informed changes in the way judges behave, develop their jurisprudence, develop their ideologies, and thus challenge or interact or engage with other state institutions. So that's kind of the idea of the audience framework. And I think also what's important there is therefore to not just look at judges ki kitni formal independence hai, judges ki, is the executive controlling judicial appointments or not. That's important too, but also the networks judges are coming from, because they matter for judges' esteem, for how judges feel, their legitimacy, right, their esteem. And so thinking not just about the formal institution that judges care about and see as audiences, but also the informal networks, stakeholders, etc., that judges see as key audiences. And my thesis in the book was that the military's role as an audience, while always salient in Pakistan's history for the judiciary, its salience decreased over time, right? It still remained important, but less important as an audience than it was in the 50s and 60s compared to the 90s and 80s, 90s, 2000s, 90s, 2000s. So that was my argument, basically. Yeah.
सही है. तो एट द सेंटर ऑफ दिस आर्ग्यूमेंट इज कि जजेस जो हैं वो अपनी रेपुटेशन बिल्ड कर रहे हैं किसी के सामने. अब वो किस ग्रुप के सामने अपनी रेपुटेशन बिल्ड कर रहे हैं इज द कोर क्वेश्चन हेयर. और शुरुआत कहानी की यहाँ से होती है कि ऑफ कोर्स शुरू में तो वो मिलिट्री के साथ अपनी रेपुटेशन बिल्ड कर रहे हैं बिकॉज उनकी अपॉइंटमेंट्स, प्रमोशंस, रिमूवल, सैंक्शंस, ये सारी जो चीज़ें हैं वो मिलिट्री के साथ जुड़ी हुई हैं. और जाहिर है अगर वो मिलिट्री को खुश नहीं रखेंगे, अपने बेनिफैक्टर्स को खुश नहीं रखेंगे, तो फिर उनका करियर वहीं ख़त्म हो जाएगा. राइट. सो एक तो ये बात है कि ये फॉर्मल प्रोसीजर्स जो हैं ये क्या है. और आपको शायद पता होगा कि अयूब खान के ज़माने में अयूब खान खुद हैंड पिक करते थे हाई कोर्ट और सुप्रीम कोर्ट के जजेस. अच्छा, फलाना फलाने का बेटा है, फलाना फलाने का पोता है, हाँ ये ट्रस्टेड बंदा है, इसको एलिवेट करते हैं. सो एक वो तरीका था. सो ऑब्वियसली जजेस वर बिहोल्डन टू देयर मिलिट्री ओवरलॉर्ड्स इन अ सेंस. एंड नॉट जस्ट दैट, मिलिट्री आपको पता है बहुत गहरे तरीके से इंस्टीट्यूशनली लिंक्ड थी टू द सिविल ब्यूरोक्रेसी एज वेल. एंड दे वर पार्टनर्स इन क्राइम. एंड जो सिविल ब्यूरोक्रेसी थी, जो सिविल सर्विस थी, आपके ज़्यादातर जो जजेस थे उस ज़माने में वो सिविल सर्विस से आते थे. तो ये दो चीज़ें, एक तो ये कि अपॉइंटिंग अथॉरिटी कौन है, वो मिलिट्री है. और दूसरा ये है कि आपका सोशल या प्रोफेशनल नेटवर्क कहाँ से है जहाँ से आपको अपॉइंट या एलिवेट किया जा रहा है. सो मिलिट्री एंड सिविल सर्विस वर द टू इंस्टीट्यूशंस जो पॉलिटिकली भी डोमिनेंट रहीं और जो जजेस की एक तरह से ऑडियंस थी जिनके सामने वो जजेस अपनी रेपुटेशन बिल्ड कर रहे थे. Am I right?
100%.
And just trying to kind of simplify and so अब आप ये कह रहे हैं कि वो ऑडियंस बदल
चुके थे. Exactly.
So एक तो अपॉइंटमेंट्स का प्रोसेस बदल गया है, कौन अपॉइंट करता है वो सारी कहानी तब्दील हो गई है. और वो सोशल नेटवर्क्स जहाँ से जजेस आते हैं वो भी तब्दील हो गए हैं. अब सिविल सर्विस से बहुत कम जजेस आते हैं. ज़्यादातर अब आपके कहाँ से आते हैं जजेस?
From the bar, right? From the bar of professional lawyers, exactly. And for me, I think that was the most, it's really well laid out. For me, in my research, that was the most interesting part of the research, right? To study कि अगर ये bar से judges आ रहे हैं from this legal profession, how has that changed over time? How has the politics and culture and in that bar changed over time? And how much do judges care about their reputation with the bar, right? And I think what I learned in my research was they care a lot. राइट. जजेस की अब बात करेंगे, वो कहेंगे शुरू में कहेंगे हाँ वी जस्ट केयर अबाउट द लॉ, जो भी कानून कहें दैट इज व्हाट वी बिलीव इन. बट ग्रेजुअली यू विल हियर मोर एंड मोर कॉन्वर्सेशन. अच्छा, इन लॉयर्स ने हमारे बात में ये कहा, इन लॉयर्स ने ये कहा, एंड दे कॉन्स्टेंटली फॉलोइंग व्हाट द डिफरेंट लॉयर्स से अबाउट देम, व्हाट डिफरेंट बार ग्रुप्स से अबाउट देम. इट्स रियली रियली इंपॉर्टेंट. एंड एज यू हैव इनफ कॉन्वर्सेशंस you learn more about why, right? And it's because this is the networks a lot of them come from, right? They've worked in them. Ab dekhiye, when you become a judge at the age of 45, right? And you're a judge to the age of 62. Now that means before that ke aap lawyer bane the probably the age of 22. So 22 to 45, that's a lot of years. Over 20 years, right? You are a lawyer in the bar, becoming a high court lawyer, maybe becoming a Supreme Court lawyer, getting to know people in your fellow lawyers. That's your network. और जब आप 62 पे retire हो जाते हैं, if you're a high court lawyer, you're not going to just retire and go home. You're probably going to go back to practicing again in that bar. So your career is bookended by the time you spend amongst lawyers, right? So that's your network, and you keep interacting with them before and after, and you care a lot about, judges care a lot about their reputation with that network for obvious reasons, right? But it's also really interesting to see the changes that happened in the bar as a network, right? So Hamara bar has always, lawyers have been always involved in different ways in political moments in our history, right? There's no doubt of that, right? Whether it's early post-colonial period or then the 1968 Ayub Khan, anti-Ayub Khan movement, there's always been important segments of the legal profession. So as I was saying, they've been involved in different points in our history. But I think, and then again against Bhutto in 77, but I think what's really interesting, for me, the most interesting part of what I discovered in my research was this moment in around 78, 79, that Zia-ul Haq has come into power. Zia-ul Haq has banned all political activity in the country. Yani ki kahin bhi you can't have elections or major political activity. One of the first places he removes the ban from is professional associations, right? Now that is your, I guess, medical associations, your bar associations, etc. And I think what that does is it makes the bar associations one of the only venues left in the country where politics can still be practiced and done openly. And what you notice is, I remember doing my research कि आप bar association की elections आप देखें 1976 में और 1979 में in the newspapers. 1976 में bar association की election, this is like कराची bar और लाहौर high court bar, पे एक paragraph होगा, it'd be like 5 lines. 1979 में you had a full page on the different bar association candidates. Reason being there's no other elections to report on, right? तो खबरें भी उसी पे हैं. Focus is over there, and suddenly the bar becomes a much more visible and prominent place for politics, right, to be practiced. Not just as, and I think that really makes the bar a very important venue for a lot of lawyers who are more politically motivated or politically interested to move towards the bar and gravitate towards the bar and bar associations as an important area and arena of practice, right? And you see, therefore, gradually over the 80s and 90s, in the bar association, in the bar life, lawyers are more and more first on agitational. They get organized with, to support the MRD, be part of that movement in the time against Zia. But then also, they start, so one of the really fun parts was looking at bar association resolutions. The way in which the bar starts talking about and having opinions on every aspect of government and governance. Is chief pe criticize government needs to do this, government needs to do that. So it starts with challenging Zia, right? Saying that, this military government is problematic, etc. There are large segments of the bar, it's not a monolith, but large segments of the bar that were committed to sort of an agitation against the military regime. But then even after the Zia's regime ends, their interests go beyond the military regime itself to politics more broadly. Jo bhi governments kare, jo bhi hukumatein kare, they'll have critiques of that, they'll have opinions on that, they'll have their preferences on that. And so the bar becomes that believes that hum jo hai, we have a right to have an opinion and a say on every aspect of our politics and governance. Now, we can't engage directly in politics, but we are unhappy with whether it's the military or the political party, jo bhi ye sab kare, it's all very problematic. The institution we have that we would like to see doing more in our political system is the judiciary, right? Hum wahi jate hain, that's our institution. So you see this interesting relationship between the two becoming much more important in shaping the judges who are emerging from that bar, from this bar that's becoming increasingly politically engaged, advocates for an increasingly interventionist approach from within the judiciary, and judges responding to this, therefore, because this is their most salient audience, right? Because they're coming from these networks, and also increasingly the lawyers in the bar and like senior law firm members also become increasingly important in the appointment process also. So it's not just the fact that this is the network they come from who they interact with, but it's also okay when you see judges take control of the judicial appointment process or start taking more control over it in 96, 97, formally it's within the chief justices, but who do the chief justices all talk to? Usually it's their law firm members, their leaders of the bar, who the bar group they belong to, उससे बात करेंगे, आप किसको recommend करते हैं, आप किसको shortlist करें, blah, blah, blah. And there's always this informally more and more prominent role of the senior lawyers who are close to the judges in the career process as well. So both ways, the bar is becoming a more and more important audience for the judges, and the bar is increasingly advocating for a more interventionist approach from those judges, right? And I think that really is the part of the story that I'm happy to talk more about, but I found really, really interesting to study and learn more about in my research. Yeah.
That's very, very interesting. तो मैं ये पूछना चाहूँगी कि ये जो lawyers हैं, चलें ये audience तब्दील हो गई और जजेस जो थे वो अपनी रेपुटेशन बिल्ड करने लगे लॉयर्स के साथ तो ये लॉयर्स का कुछ समझाएं क्योंकि इनकी समझ नहीं आती कुछ एक तरफ वो एंटी एस्टैब्लिशमेंट भी हैं ठीक है फिर वो सियासतदान को भी हकारत की नज़र से देखते हैं ठीक है इनको एम्पावर जिस गवर्नमेंट ने किया पीपीपी की गवर्नमेंट ने 70 की दहाई में ये सारे चेंजेस आए टर्निंग पॉइंट था 73 कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन लेकिन भुट्टो को भी मतलब वो वंस अगेन डिसडेन से देखते हैं और एंटी भुट्टो मूवमेंट भी चल पीएनए का हिस्सा भी बने ठीक है जी सो क्या माजरा है मतलब ये लॉयर्स चाहते क्या हैं और मतलब how does this then attach to this concept of judicial populism?
Yeah, great question. So I think एक तो think about again as we discussing socio-legal research. Maybe you want to think about what demographics do the lawyers, particularly the high court lawyers, and all come from, right? So they are largely urban middle class. It's an urban middle class profession, particularly the high court lawyers and etc., who are the ones who then become the judges, etc. So वहीं से आ रहे हैं. And so when we think about it, we really want to think about your urban middle class politics, right? How are they thinking about politics in the country? And one thing we know about our urban middle classes, they have a certain aspirational politics, which is that we would like to have a greater role in running our state, in managing our state. हमारे elites जो ये सारे corrupt हैं, चाहे ज़्यादातर सियासतदान बहुत corrupt हैं, they've ruined our country. ये सब we all know, we've all heard. So the bar is very much a product of a lot of that thinking. But I think because also the bar, I think it's interesting, because the bar also, given the nature of their work, lawyers also more directly sometimes are exposed to, through cases, etc., some of the military regimes, that is particularly Zia's regimes, more obvious excesses, right, and repression. They're also deep, and how that affected them professionally, right? कि PCO से हमारा काम क्या रहे, what was left of our work, of what was left of our judges, of our courts, etc., right? Or they also are more exposed to, and thus can be more critical of the way the military also operated in politics, right? So it's both elites. Yeah, ये civilians भी जो हैं, ये भी corrupt हैं, ये military भी हैं, ये भी entrenched elites हैं. And I think it was this idea that the elites that run our country, and this is something we see broadly in our middle class, जो भी elites हैं जो run our country, they are the source of the problems in our country, right? And what's distinct about I think the bar is, unlike maybe other groups in elite in like politics in Pakistan, uniquely had the judiciary as an institution where they could find a very responsive set of elites, right? The judges, right? So therefore, there was a lot of pressure for them. कि judiciary जो है, which is the institution we work with, which we can, from which we are recruited, from which judges are recruited from amongst us, etc. They're kind of one of us in some way, is the institution we think is through which we can basically create the kind of political order, governing order that we think these elites जो अभी तक हैं would never be able to, right? And that's basically I guess so. And you see this emerging, therefore, in the way the courts are operated, particularly starting in the 90s, going to 2000s, and continues, for the last 20, 25 years, right? If you think about what is judicial populism, right? Some of the key characteristics, ये कहना कि the judiciary, judgments saying we are as a court intervening in an issue because the corrupt elite have mishandled it, right? So the justification for the judiciary intervening in anything is it won't necessarily be the law says, article this says, हमें ये करने चाहिए. It's part will be that, and part will be like, these corrupt people have ruined the country, so we must intervene, right? One way or the other, or this government is too repressive, or these PIAs, held by a kleptocratic elite, or whatever, right? This kind of language informs their judgments, right? So it's an anti-elitist language, right? Then the other part will be that procedures are too restrictive, right? Because procedures don't allow us to fully intervene in issues where we think we are best suited to come up with solutions for the people, right? So then you will see कि वो कहेंगे कि हम इन issues में we'll bypass procedures, तो हम suo moto लेंगे, चाहे कोई petition भी नहीं आई, चाहे कोई petitioner bhi nahi aaya, but we'll just go in. We think this is an issue. We will go into it. Why? Because currently this issue is being handled by corrupt people, right? And so it was this idea that institutions, whether it's the military governments or civilian government, do not represent the people. For the bar is the people, right? We are the people. And therefore the institution that best represents us as the people is the judiciary. So we want the judiciary to play a much broader, more ambitious role in our politics because they are better equipped to represent us in our politics than any of these other institutions. So it's really an aspiration to control politics in some way and be leading political stakeholders in a country where they just don't trust and don't respect the other political stakeholders. And I think this is broadly a urban middle class kind of echoes that politics by and large for the last few decades, but it comes out in a particular form that valorizes the judiciary because it comes through the bar and its legal practitioners. Yeah.
तो ये एक किस्म का इंस्टीट्यूशनल सेल्फ इंटरेस्ट है आप कह रहे हैं और
Yes.
और इसके अंदर क्लास का एंगल बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग है
Yes.
और आप अर्बन मिडिल क्लास की बात कर रहे हैं ऑफ कोर्स वी ऑल नो कि जो पंजाब की बार्स हैं वो डोमिनेट करती हैं नॉट जस्ट इन नंबर्स बट ऑल्सो ऑफ कोर्स पावर स्ट्रक्चर के हवाले से जो लॉयर्स मूवमेंट चली फॉर इंस्टेंस इन मैनी वेज हमारी जो सारी लीगल मोबिलाइजेशन है या लॉयर्स मूवमेंट्स हैं वो एक तरह से आप कह सकते हैं बहुत पंजाब सेंट्रिक भी हैं बिकॉज द नंबर्स आर सो लार्ज और वो इतनी इनक्वालिटी है अगर आप नंबर्स देखें तो बहुत ज़्यादा इनक्वालिटी है सो लॉट ऑफ पावर पैक्ड इनटू द पंजाब बार्स तो सवाल ये उठता है कि एक तो तरीका है ये देखने का कि जी ये इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं ये मिलिट्री है जुडिशरी है सिविलियन पॉलिटिशियंस हैं और लॉयर्स हैं फिर आ जाता है क्लास का सवाल जो उसको थोड़ा सा कॉम्प्लिकेट कर देता है तो ठीक है आपकी ओल्ड पॉलिटिकल इलीट तो है जो क्लिप्टोक्रेटिक क्लास है जो आप कह रहे हैं या ओल्ड डायनेस्ट्स हैं फ्यूडल्स हैं या जो भी इंडस्ट्रियलिस्ट क्लास है लेकिन फिर इनटू दैट ट्रेजेक्टरी एंड इक्वेशन comes a party like the PTI, right? That really kind of, I think, attracts the urban middle class
Absolutely,
vote.
yeah.
So this is an urban middle class party to begin with, and of course
For
then.
sure, yeah.
So when you put the question of class into this framework,
Yeah.
what happens? So अभी भी क्या हम वही पुराना एक मॉडल देख रहे हैं या डू यू थिंक कि ये ऑडियंस अब थोड़ी सी तब्दील हुई है इसके अंदर क्लास का क्या रोल है और पीटीआई के आने के बाद और इमरान खान के आने के बाद और अभी भी करंटली हमने पूरा देखा जो सारा वोट ऑफ नो कॉन्फिडेंस में जुडिशल कॉन्टेस्टेशन चली है और अभी भी चल रही है और बहुत से लोग जो हैं वो इस तरह कंसेप्चुलाइज कर रहे हैं जुडिशरी को कि ये जो है ये पीटीआई का जज है वो जो है वो पीपीपी का है वो पीएमएलएन का है वो फौज का बंदा है सो ये जो एक इंटरेस्टिंग चीज़ है बार को किस तरह अब हम कैरेक्टराइज करें बार की अब क्या रिलेशनशिप है विद द पॉलिटिकल पार्टी इफ यू हैव अ पार्टी लाइक पीटीआई कम इनटू दिस सिचुएशन
So it's really interesting. There's a lot of things to think about over there because I've also been thinking about. I think anybody working in this area has to really think about these questions. How PTI challenges so much of what we've been talking about the two-party system and how that shapes the politics within the legal community. I think that what's really interesting. First of all, to start with, I think PTI ki jo kahani hai, it cannot be told, in my opinion, without the lawyers' movement. Because the lawyers' movement, I think, is in some ways, now there's different groups in the the lawyers' movement, I think, is in some ways, now there's different groups in the lawyer, but my theory that I haven't tested yet, so I'll throw it out here and then you can tell me if it's wrong, is that the lawyers' movement is and Iftikhar Chaudhry is like a proto PTI Imran Khan, right? In the sense that it's a movement, it's built around, it's sort of political sort of vision and its appeal was that ये जो मुशर्रफ government है, it is enabling and empowering certain elites, and there is a discontented middle class that finds the suo motu judgments, the governance judgment. अब देखिए इफ्तिखार चौधरी के सब judgment जैसे were on things like residential communities, like drainage, water. All of these are governance issues that really affect your urban middle class, and the suo motu approach was really appealing for that reason, right? And this is something I've learned from Maryam's work actually a lot about how sort of the kind of cases that became so much part of the public interest litigation of Iftikhar Chaudhry, which made him so popular, were these cases that directly interested the urban middle class that felt like ये जो elite system है, जो captured system है, doesn't really give us a space to have these issues addressed, our governance issues, etc. Right? So then when Iftikhar Chaudhry is taken out, the lawyers won't come in its support. I think its appeal lies in the fact that it represented a particular interest of that urban middle class, urban middle class at the time. But also, if you look at the lawyers' movement's own members, right? Certainly, there's the leaderships that on the one hand, but most of the others, what was rule of law to the lawyers' movement? Was it कि हाँ हमें आइन की बात, judicial independence, whatever? It was in many ways a kind of what I would call a rule of law populism, right? It was कि we want to use the courts, we want to use the law as a way to get revenge almost from the elite. Elite ने जो हमारा, the way they've ruined our country, we want to use the law basically to take revenge against them, right? So this idea that It's not about the rule of law as a way to follow procedures, follow rules. It's about a rule of law is one. We get rule of law when we bring down our elites, right? So regardless of whether we're following procedure, regardless of whether we're following commitment to the rules, right? So if you look at the Panama case, right, that's a classic example, okay? It's a case built around definitely deviating from procedural rules, norms, constraints to give a judgment that there was a big audience that absolutely loved it, right? And I remember I was at the Lahore High Court a few weeks before the Panama judgment, and there was a Supreme Court Barki rally there. And all of it was just, there was the Supreme Court bar president, all of these people just shouting, go Nawaz, go Nawaz, go. This is the lawyers, right? This is the legal community. And not all of them are PTI, by the way. Some of them who were there were very anti-PTI, and I knew that. But when I spoke to some of them, I was like, but you know, what is, they're like, they can ऐसी justice only. We can't wait for justice, right? We need it now, right? And that feeling that we need justice and we need it now was there in the lawyers' movement, and it's there in the PTI. And so the PTI then becomes literally that, the movement for justice. It builds on a lot of those sentiments of the lawyers' movement, and I think it builds a lot of the mobilization techniques we see the PTI build up over time are in many ways rooted in what we see happening in 2007 and 2008, right? And that grievance that they capitalize on, Imran Khan and the party, is one that we already saw echoes of in the lawyers' movement and in the sort of unusual adulation for Iftikhar Chaudhry, right? But if Imran Khan takes it to a whole other scale, right? So there is certainly, I think, that urban middle class politics that you see first take some organized form in the lawyers' movement, and then take a really broader, bigger politically organized form in PTI, right? And that's why people like Hamid Khan and all of these are members of PTI, right? And so so then to the other question you asked about political parties and the bar and how that will shape things in the bar, right? So I think, so on the one hand, I think political parties since the lawyers' movement have realized the value and importance of having some segment of the bar or bar leadership on their side. And there's been a lot of work to co-opt different segments and leaders in the bar by different political parties, right? So we have the law minister currently is Azam Taran, who has basically been a bar leader for I don't know how many decades now, like within the independent group, the Asma Jahangir group. Ehsan Ghoon is a leading figure in the PPP, or connected to the PPP, not a leading figure. But the point being that Arvind Saki is also connected to the PPP. These parties have realized the importance of having important bar leaders brought in closer to the parties. And it's also built on a two-way exchange. Because bar has become so much more prominent, bar association elections have become so much more expensive. I mean, look at the Lahore High Court bar, as you said, right? It's an 11-month election campaign, right? I mean, for a one-year position, right? So that's a lot of money you need. So political parties are critically important to funding those campaigns. So there's an exchange. Bar leaders are drawing closer to political parties, and they are building that relationship. And I think what you've seen is, but at the same time, and so you're definitely seeing, the political parties, particularly the PPP and PMLN, using the same mechanism of patronage to co-opt bar association leaders who can then bring the bar to serve segments of the bar to serve them in particular ways. But the PTI is different. Not in saying it doesn't do patronage politics. I do think that there's a lot more people within the bar who genuinely support PTI, regardless of the patronage or not, because of the natural appeal of PTI's political platform to people in the bar, right? To the very kind of lawyers' movement, rule of law populism that we talked about, right? So Hamid Khan is the other big figure in the bar. Now, incidentally, he lost the Supreme Court Bar Association election recently, or his faction did. So I think that speaks to the continuing importance of patronage, right? That Azam Taran and all are continuing able to use the vehicles of patronage to maintain their vote banks within the bar, to manage and win elections, etc. And that's good, right? I mean, and that's politics for them, right? That's how they do their politics. But I think even if there's a lot of people, even within these groups, who are probably much more sympathetic to Imran Khan, because I think in Imran Khan, in the bar, there's a very natural constituency, I think, for PTI's politics and for Imran Khan. Now, I think, at least that's my speculative opinion. So I think that should we see I think we will gradually see the way sort of growing momentum within lawyers. I don't know how organized it will be, but growing momentum to at least support PTI and Imran Khan in certain ways, because I think the politics kind of align in interesting and important ways. But then maybe we see some. What do you think? Like, I'm also interested to know what you think on that.
I have no idea, and I'm going to suspend my own opinion.
Yeah. So this is also
But
my
I think
speculative
no,
opinion.
I think it's a really good start, and so it leads me into the next question, which is कि ये rule of law और ये जो सारी बातें हैं, मतलब ठीक है, आपकी बार जो है वो कुछ मोमेंट्स पे काफ़ी यकजहती का करती है, ऑफ कोर्स मैनिफेस्ट करती है. MRD में आपने बताया मूवमेंट फॉर रेस्टोरेशन ऑफ डेमोक्रेसी में इनका बड़ा रोल था 80s में, फिर एंटी मुशर्रफ मूवमेंट में. लेकिन वैसे कहा जाता है कि बार काफ़ी डिवाइडेड है, मतलब ऐसे नहीं है कि कंप्लीट उसके अंदर कोई पॉलिटिकल पोलराइजेशन है, जिस तरह फॉर इंस्टेंस टर्की की बार में बड़ा 50-50 पॉलिटिकल स्प्लिट है. सो उस तरह की डेंजरस पोलराइजेशन या फ्रैगमेंटेशन नहीं है, काफ़ी मतलब फ़र्क गिरोह हैं फ़र्क बार्स में. हमें पता है कि कास्ट और बिरादरी बहुत बड़ा रोल प्ले करती है. हमें पता है कि आई थिंक एथनो लिंग्विस्टिक एथनो रीजनल डिवाइड्स भी बहुत हैं, और भी बहुत से फ़र्क. आई थिंक क्लीवेजेस होंगी. सो क्लीवेजेस बहुत हैं बार के अंदर, राइट. और ये जो आप बात कर रहे हैं ना कि पार्टीज़ आर मेकिंग एन एफर्ट कि वो किसी तरह कोऑप्ट करें कुछ ग्रुप्स को, डोमिनेंट ग्रुप्स को, डोमिनेंट बार्स को, डोमिनेंट लीडरशिप को. तो ये बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग है बिकॉज डेफिनेटली ये क्लीवेजेस एक्सप्लॉइट हो सकते हैं, राइट. सो मेरा सवाल ये है कि अगर पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज उन क्लीवेजेस को एक्सप्लॉइट और कोऑप्ट कर रही हैं तो मिलिट्री क्या कर रही है?
It's a good question, or I would say कि एक तो I think political parties are better positioned, I think, to exploit cleavages because they are more rooted. I mean, it's simple way to think about it is that a political party can have lawyers as part of the political party. The military can't have lawyers as part of the military, right? You have your JAG lawyers, but they're still military members. So you'll have lawyers who are affiliated or tied or opportunistically aligned with the military, but they aren't in the military, right? Political parties, आप पार्टी में आ जाएं, आप ऑफिस ले लें, आप बन जाए हमारा हिस्सा, they can do that, right? So therefore, always I think political parties are better equipped to directly interject themselves into sort of exploiting these cleavages in a way the military is not as well. What the military can do is things like, अच्छा आप बार एसोसिएशन इलेक्शन में हिस्सा ले रहे हैं, and this is something we've seen enough about. We'll help you win the election, we'll give you certain support. In exchange, we would like you to put forward certain positions, right? So it's a slightly more, that's what they can do. They can't say, okay, you can, if you do this, you can join our party, you can become a senator, you can become this, you can join. At most, they can say, if you win this, you can join that party and become a senator, etc., right? So the ability to expose those cleavages, I think political parties are better equipped to do. But I think the military does think about ways in which they can use, first of all, like we saw this in 2006, before 2007, right? Malik Qayyum, when he was the head of the Supreme Court Bar Association, he was very good at making sure that the bar was divided enough that there were large groups within the bar that were benefiting from certain military privileges, benefits, etc. Even during the PTI previous period, you saw, I think, who was the law minister at the time? Farooq Naseem, right? Farooq Naseem was going around giving gifts to different of money to different bar leaders in exchange, of promising residential societies and blah blah blah. So there is a whole politics, and the military does through its these people engage in that kind of politics as well. But I think political parties are better equipped to, because there's more that they can offer a lawyer. A lawyer is not going to suddenly become a general, right? But he can become a senator, right? And I think that's an important distinction. And that's why all our history, our military has never been able to act unilaterally, because it's not just it, unless it's always needed some kind of civilian, political party, political actor to ally with it, work with it, to co-opt the people it needs to co-opt at different moments and exploit those cleavages at different times. And that's how it works with the bar as well.
I think that's brilliant. And I'm going to stop now. So thank you so much, Dr. Kureshi, for such a wonderful exposition of your book. We're going to just go into now the Q&A.
Yes.
And I'd like to invite Adnan Bajwa to please moderate that.
बहुत शुक्रिया डॉक्टर साहब. मेरा बैकग्राउंड तो लॉ का नहीं है, लेकिन एक एज हंबल लर्नर, एज हंबल स्टूडेंट के तौर पर मैं सुन रहा सी. इस दे बावजूद मैं माजरत पहले चा लेना मंग लेना जेह्ड़े मैं सवाल पुछन लगा मैं बहुत स्टूपिड क्वेश्चन ना होण लेकिन सब तो पहले जेह्ड़ा तुसीं शुरू कीता अगर ऑडियंस दी भी इजाज़त होवे आई एम श्योर यू हैव क्वेश्चंस तो मैं पहले अपनी प्रिविलेज नू सिंस वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट सीकिंग प्रिविलेजेस और सीकिंग पावर तो मैं पहले एक्सप्लॉइट कर लैनू सो ਤੁਸੀਂ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰੇਟਿਵ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਮਿਲਟਰੀ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਇਕਨੋਮਿਕ ਕੰਸਰਨਸ ਹੋਣ ਜਾਂ ਸਿਕਿਉਰਿਟੀ ਕੰਸਰਨਸ ਹੋਣ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਸਾਡਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰੇਟਿਵ ਹੈ ਬਿਕਾਜ਼ ਵੀ ਆਰ ਮੋਰ ਨੈਸ਼ਨਲਿਸਟ ਵੀ ਆਰ ਮੋਰ ਕੰਸਰਨਡ ਵੀ ਆਰ ਮੋਰ ਪੈਟਰੀਓਟਸ ਦੈਨ ਐਨੀਬਡੀ ਐਲਸ ਕਿ ਅਗਰ ਮੁਲਕ ਨੂੰ ਇਕਨੋਮਿਕ ਨੁਕਸਾਨ ਹੋਏਗਾ ਜਾਂ ਮੁਲਕ ਨੂੰ ਸਿਕਿਉਰਿਟੀ ਦਾ ਕੋਲੈਪਸ ਹੋਏਗਾ ਸੋ ਉਹ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਕੰਸਰਨ ਹੈ ਸੋ ਉਹ ਇਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰੇਟਿਵ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਨੇ ਐਂਡ ਦੈਨ ਜਜਿਸ ਹੈਵ देयर ओन ਕੰਸਰਨਸ ਐਜ਼ ਵੈਲ स्कूलों की फीस थोड़ी करो ट्रांसपोर्टेशन दवो स्मोक ठीक नहीं हो रही वो फलां जो हॉस्पिटल है वी हैव सीन रीसेंट जज वेयरिंग ब्लैक ग्लासेस और डॉक्टर के मुँह से जाके मार रहे हैं सो असी किस तरह इंटेंशनस का किवें अंदाज़ा ला सकते हैं ऑफ कोर्स वी वुड लाइक टू लिव इन अ सेफ एंड सिक्योर कंट्री प्रोगेटिव जिंदा भी होवे वी वुड लाइक टू लिव इन अ कंट्री जिहड़ा कि इकनॉमिकली स्टेबल है ਇਹਦੀ ਪੋਜ਼ਿਟਿਵ ਚੀਜ਼ ਹੈ ਐਂਡ ਆਫ ਕੋਰਸ ਅਸੀਂ ਚਾਹਾਂਗੇ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਮਾਹੌਲ ਸਾਫ਼ ਹੋਵੇ ਸਕੂਲਾਂ ਦੀ ਫੀਸ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈ ਇਕਨੋਮਿਕਲ ਹੋਵੇ ਪਾਣੀ ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮਸਾਇਲ ਹੋਣ ਸੋ ਪਹਿਲਾ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ ਆਈ ਡੋਂਟ ਨੋ ਮੈਂ ਅਗਰ ਕੰਸਰਨ ਸ਼ੇਅਰ ਕਰ ਸਕਿਆ ਜਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇਖਾਂਗੇ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਇੰਟੈਂਸ਼ਨ ਲੌਂਗ ਟਰਮ ਜਾਂ ਲੀਗਲ ਪੁਆਇੰਟ ਆਫ ਵਿਊ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਮੁਲਕ ਨੂੰ ਫਾਇਦਾ ਪਹੁੰਚਾ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਜਾਂ ਨੁਕਸਾਨ ਪਹੁੰਚਾ ਰਹੀ ਸੋ ਮਾਈ ਫਰਸਟ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ
So your first question is the way the judiciary approaches or the military?
Both
Approach.
How do we judge the intentions and how good these intentions could be for the longer run?
Good, bilkul. So I would say it's an interesting question to think about because this is unfortunately this is ultimately Pakistan's problem is both our unelected institutions think we know better, right, for the country. किस वजह से? क्योंकि हम पार्टीज में तकसीम नहीं है, हम एथनिसिटी से डिवाइडेड नहीं है, हालांकि हैं मगर institutionally they do not present themselves in that way. It's this idea कि somehow being politicians means you are captured by some lobby, some interest. You can't think for the national interest, right? And it's about how you conceive of the national interest, right? So I mean, the way we as sort of social scientists try to conceive with national interest is always a product of a consensus of different groups and different interests coming together and working out what is best that accommodates everyone's interests together in the best possible way, right? Magar for the military and the judiciary, I think, and this is broadly across our like unelected bureaucracy, there is often a sense that national interest is often a singular idea that isn't produced by a broader national conversation, right? And so for judges and for generals, I think this is often a thing कि आपकी politicians जो हैं वो तो आप आ रहे हैं कि आप सिंधी लॉबी से आ रहे हैं या आप पंजाबी लॉबी से आ रहे हैं या आप चलो ट्रेडर्स लॉबी से आ रहे हैं या उस लॉबी से आ रहे हैं आपका कोई ना कोई और इंटरेस्ट होगा या इंटरेस्ट ग्रुप होगा that is informing the way you approach these things and so we know better because we are not beholden to these interests, right? And I think that ultimately is very difficult, challenging in a country like Pakistan because in a country like Pakistan where so many different identities, so many different cleavages, as we were talking about, are so heavily politically organized and politicized, you have to be able to address them all and find a system through which solutions are gotten that includes the voices of as many of these as possible, right? And that means the politicians from all of these groups have to be involved and engaged in the process to which you make policy, you make decisions as much as possible. And the judiciary and the military, by thinking that division, that factionism undermines good policy, undermines good judgment, try to take that process out of the courts, out of the parliament, out of these institutions, and into the judiciary or the military, where they are not sort of decided by those processes. And I think long term that is problematic because when you have a process of policy making and governance which doesn't include all these voices, you will end up with more and more resentment. You may not get the ideal policies, etc. This doesn't mean, for example, that there is a net advantage to having more than one unelected institution thinking it knows best, right? Because one of the problems in a lot of Pakistan's history was only the judiciary, military thought it knew best, right? In the last 20 years, you've seen the courts also think we also know best. And just having two institutions know best is more voices than one, right? And I think that's interesting in its own right because politicians also start learning to navigate the space. If these two institutions don't align, how can we use this to get our point forward? How can we use this fragmentation as we're looking at to get our perspective forward, right? How do we make alliances, etc., right? So I think it's interesting that we have two institutions that think they know better rather than one, and that's better than having just one institution thinking it knows better. But ultimately, I think we should have a system in which all voices through the political process are able to be better expressed in the policy making process.
Thank you. This was a brilliant answer. If I may ask another question.
Sure, sure.
ਸੋ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਜੱਜਸ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਕੰਸਰਨ ਨੇ ਕਿ ਆਫਟਰ ਦੇ ਰਿਟਾਇਰਮੈਂਟ ਦੇ ਆਰ ਗੋਇੰਗ ਬੈਕ ਅਗੇਨ ਟੂ ਪ੍ਰੈਕਟਿਸ ਐਂਡ ਦੈਨ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਲਾਸ ਰਿਜ਼ੈਂਟਮੈਂਟ ਦੀ ਵੀ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਕਿ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਜੱਜਸ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ ਗ੍ਰਜਸ ਰੱਖਦੇ ਨੇ ਅਗੇਂਸਟ ਦੀ ਅਦਰ ਕਲਾਸ ਔਰ ਫਿਰ ਉਹ ਇੰਝ ਹੀ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਕਿ ਚੀਕ ਵਗੈਰਾ ਹੀ ਬਣ ਗਿਆ ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਚੀਫ ਜਸਟਿਸ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈ ਉਹਨੇ ਹੁਣ ਸਾਰੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਗਰੀਬਾਂ ਦੇ ਮਸਲੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ ਉਹਨੇ ਚੁੱਕ ਲਏ ਨੇ ਭਾਵੇਂ 10,000 ਗਰੀਬ ਬਾਹਰ ਖੜੇ ਹੋਣ ਬੜਾ ਉਹਨੇ ਇਹ ਦੇਖਣਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਫਲਾਂ ਗਲੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਾਣੀ ਠੀਕ ਜਾ ਰਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਨਹੀਂ ਜਾ ਰਿਹਾ ਸੋ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਜੱਜਸ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਕਲਾਸ ਕਿਹੜੀ ਹੈ ਔਰ ਉਹ ਕਲਾਸ ਕਿਸ ਹੱਦ ਤੱਕ ਡਿਟਰਮਿਨ ਕਰਦੀ ਹੈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਬਾਅਦ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਐਕਸਪੈਕਟਿਡ ਆਡੀਅנס ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਵਾਬ ਦੇਣਾ ਹੈ ਜਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸੈਲਰੀ ਔਰ ਪ੍ਰਿਵਿਲੇਜਸ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਕਿਸ ਹੱਦ ਤੱਕ ਇਨਫਲੂਐਂਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਦੁਬਾਰਾ ਪ੍ਰੈਕਟਿਸ ਦੀ ਤਰਫ ਆਉਣ ਇਜ਼ ਇਟ ਜਸਟ ਦ ਮਨੀ ਦੈਟ ਦੇ ਵਾਂਟ ਟੂ ਗੈਟ ਜਾਂ ਫਿਰ ਕੀ ਵਜ੍ਹਾ ਹੈ ਔਰ ਕਲਾਸ ਯੂਜੂਲੀ ਕਿਹੜੀ ਕਲਾਸ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਜੱਜਸ ਦੀ ਸਿੰਸ ਤੁਸੀਂ 70s ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਕਿ ਉਦੋਂ ਸਿਵਲ ਸਰਵੈਂਟਸ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸਨ ਐਂਡ ਯੂਜੂਲੀ ਸਿਵਲ ਸਰਵੈਂਟਸ ਵੁੱਡ ਬੀ ਕਮਿੰਗ ਫਰਮ ਅ ਪਰਟੀਕੂਲਰ ਕਲਾਸ ਲੇਕਿਨ ਹੁਣ ਚੂँकि ਬਾਹਰ ਤੋਂ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਨੇ ਸੋ ਫਿਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਕਿਹੜੀ ਕਲਾਸ ਡਿਟਰਮਿਨ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਮਤਲਬ ਮੈਂ ਕਿ ਸਵਾਲ ਸਮਝਾ ਪਾਇਆ ਤੇ
Sure, sure. So you're asking कि class judges कितनी determine करते हैं how these judges operate and also कि how much of it is material interests versus other interests
Yes,
as well, right?
yes.
So absolutely, really, I mean that's a question I think कि I also think a lot about. कि एक तो first of all, not all judges are coming from the exact same grouping, right? तो कुछ judges होंगे कि they'll come maybe they'll be so one marker I use for elite status in my book is having a foreign education, right? Because it's pretty hard to get a foreign education, and I have a foreign education, but and we have to acknowledge our own positionality in this. But I think that foreign education is a marker that you have a certain level of privilege, that you're able to afford that, and then come back to practice and become a judge in Pakistan, right? And that kind of marker may mean that your audience may be different from a lot of the other judges who may not be coming from that same particularly privileged network that is able to afford and accommodate that kind of lifestyle and those life choices. But I think that therefore majority of judges do come from the urban middle class, right? Not necessarily the top elite, because I think the top elite mostly would prefer private law, very honestly. It's much more money, it's much more lucrative, and that's very often what you see, right? Like I've talked to some of the most the lawyers in the top law firms, but and they'll be like, look at the salary cut we'll have to take if we become judges, right? It's huge, the salary cut for them. And so if you're in that 1%, then maybe the judiciary is very few judges will come from that 1%. Some do, there's no doubt, some important judges have and still do, right? But a lot don't, right? And so for a lot, it's also the economic mobility and privilege that comes with the position, right? अब सैलरी की बात होती है, but I think it's also job stability कि आपके 20 साल ये होगी, and then what it does for your career as a lawyer when you leave the judiciary. But I think it's also but if I think that how they're motivated then by these interests because of the fact that they want to maintain salaries and have a good career afterwards, it's not just the material interest. It's also I mean just anecdotally, I remember speaking to one judge and he was telling me कि आप देखिए जब मैं कोर्ट रूम में प्रैक्टिस करता हूँ तो मैं देखता हूँ कि ये जो लोग हैं कितने तालियां मुझे मिल रही हैं, right? I mean, and I'm not trying to say back, but he said this, right? He was explaining this thing क्योंकि फिर उससे मुझे पता चलता है कि I'm having an impact, I'm having an effect. So I was like, now there's no material gain there, right? But it's a real, most obvious statement about the fact that you, as a judge, you're sitting on this pedestal, you're sitting on this platform. You want people to like you. You want the people sitting in front of you on the benches, etc., to think well of you. And especially because our bar is so expressive, is so collectively mobilized. When they do that, they want to know that they'll say things in your favor. Another judge said, he's like, like in many ways, the bar can be like a loudspeaker for judges, right? Agar hamara point of view, our reputation, our esteem, who's going to speak up for us, right? Hum to, officially they say hum to sirf judgments, we only speak through our judgments, which is obviously nonsense, right? But it's because they wish they could speak through much more, and because they can't, They want the bar to speak up for them, to build their reputations, right? To say things on their behalf. So it's not just the material interest. It is the idea that everybody likes to be liked by the people they want to be liked by, right? And they care about reputation, they care about legitimacy, they care about esteem, and lawyers are the most important group through which a judge builds all that, right? And the bar. And so sorry, the second question was, I forgot, sorry, if you could just remind.
ਸੋ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਡੀਅנס ਐਕਸਪੈਕਟਡ ਆਡੀਅנס ਹੈ ਆਫਟਰ ਦ ਰਿਟਾਇਰਮੈਂਟ ਉਹ ਕੰਸਰਨਡ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਨੇ ਜੈਸੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਪੀਟੀਆਈ ਦੀ ਮਿਸਾਲ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਹੈ ਐਂਡ ਦੈਨ देयर इज ਅ ਕੈਟਾਗਰੀ ਆਫ ਜੱਜਸ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਚੋਂ ਕਿਸੇ ਨਾ ਕਿਸੇ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਪੋਲੀਟੀਸ਼ੀਅਨ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜੇ ਨੇ
ਜੀ ਜੀ
ਸੋ ਉਹ ਆਪਣੀ ਆਡੀਅנס ਨੂੰ ਕੰਸਰਨਡ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਨੇ ਬਿਕਾਜ਼ ਆਈ ਹੈਵ ਬੀਨ ਲਿਸਨਿੰਗ ਫਿਊ ਜੱਜਸ आफ्टर देयर रिटायरमेंट चीफ जस्टिस ने कोई तो कह रहे हैं कि मैं तो बहुत कुछ करना चाहता सी लेकिन फलां ने रोकया मैं बहुत ही अच्छा आदमी है मैं बहुत इंटेंशन अच्छी रखता तो इस तरह मैं क्या उन्होंने क्लास किस तरह उन्होंने ऑडियंस
तो एक तो दिस रियली गुड क्वेश्चन ऑब्वियसली बिकमिंग अ जज से खास तौर पे अगर आप सुप्रीम कोर्ट जज बनते हैं तो आपकी स्टेटस बढ़ जाती है यू आर नाउ अ पार्ट ऑफ अ पर्टिकुलर एलीट राइट एंड दैट आल्सो चेंजेस द पीपल यू इंटरैक्ट विद तो जैसे एक जज ने मुझे ये भी बताया कि जब हम शुरू करते हैं the people we engage with are very different from the ones we will be seeing more of when we go up the ladder, right? तो एक तो कुछ judges होंगे जो खासतौर पे जब इस्लामाबाद पहुंचेंगे तो there'll be more fauji people who will want to meet them once they've reached a certain significance and relevance. There will be more who will want to meet them. Now whether they meet them or not, that's different. But there will be more who want to meet them. Another said कि हमें जब when we're lawyers we are more it is important to us कि justice होनी चाहिए लेकिन जब हम जजेस बनते हैं कुछ देर बाद हम ये भी सीख लेते हैं कि स्टेट इंटरेस्ट भी एक चीज होती है राइट because obviously now they're meeting a lot more government people right they're talking to a lot more government people who think देखें आप देखें interest of the state क्या है इसमें how and I'll give you a good example right the 21st Amendment case okay so this was the military courts the case where they decide that military courts should they be constitutional or not to deal with the Taliban at the time right now one of the really interesting things that's done is that the military obviously at that time this is way back in 2016 or 15 right wanted to get for that short period military courts thing for the Taliban right and one way they did it was they would go into meetings regularly with the judges and show them videos of things that the Taliban are doing right of the terrorists are doing right etc to really convince them that this is the side you need to be on right you need to support it because of all the horrors being done right etc and with regardless jo law kahe kanun kahe this is what you need to be standing for right and I think the fact that they get that kind of time with the judges face time with the judges in that position in the Supreme Court means they will shape and impact the way judges think about things like state interest right so when they're meeting members of the government members of the military more and more particularly as you go up the ladder I think these ideas and as you become part of that network more and more, right? So like somebody said, some judges will continue to mostly interact with the lawyers. Some judges will start only interacting with government officers, right? That also happens. Then their audience has shifted. Then their interests have shifted. So there's an institutional story. There's an individual story that varies institution from judge to judge also. And it's interesting to see how the background, the choices judges make as they go up the ladder will shape. So for example, let's take someone like I would think like Justice Jawad Khwaja, right? Like he clearly didn't care what the bar thought of him as a Supreme Court Chief Justice, right? So they boycotted him, blah blah blah. That's a very different relationship to the bar than maybe someone like Saqib Nisar, who really cared what the bar thought of him, right? And was deeply invested in bar politics throughout, even as Chief Justice, right? So you see there are differences from judge to judge, and that's something they think about after they leave their job as well then right because then that'll shape the kind of networks they're part of and participating in after they leave the job as well right so.
Brilliant answer thank you last question agar audience gussa na kare meri tarfon their ethnicity since we have political parties who are working on as ethnic political parties how ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ethnicity ਹੈ ਉਹ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਫੈਸਲਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਦਾ ਤਾਯੁਨ ਕਰਦੀ ਹੈ ਔਰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਫਿਰ ਫੈਸਲੇ ਨੇ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਔਰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਵਿੰਸਿਸ ਦੇ ਆਪਸ 'ਚ ਕਨਫਲਿਕਟਸ ਨੇ ਫੋਰ ਇੰਸਟੈਂਸ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਰਾਵੀ ਦਾ ਇਸ਼ੂ ਹੋਇਆ ਜਾਂ ਫਲਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਮਿਸ਼ਨ ਹੈ ਉਹਦਾ ਕਿਹੜੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਵਿੰਸ ਦਾ ਕਿਹੜੀ ਐਥਨੀਸਿਟੀ ਦਾ ਆਫਿਸਰ ਬਣਨਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਹੈ ਸੋ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਜੱਜਸ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਐਥਨੀਸਿਟੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਫੈਸਲਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਨਫਲੂਐਂਸ ਕਰਦੀ ਹੈ, ਜਾਂ ਫਿਰ ਅਗਰ ਸਟੇਟ ਇੰਸਟੀਟਿਊਸ਼ਨਸ ਵੀ ਜੈਸੇ ਲੌਬਿੰਗ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ, तो जैसे मिसाल के तौर पर अगर बलूचिस्तान का इशू है, कंसर्न है, तो ये ज़रूर कहा जाता है, आर्गूमेंट दिता जाता रहा है कि चीफ जस्टिस इज़ अ बलूचिस्तानी चीफ जस्टिस वगैरह वगैरह। तो उन्होंने एथनीसिटी किस तरह अहम किरदार अदा कर दी ना, दैट्स माई लास्ट क्वेश्चन फ्रॉम माई साइड, फिर मैं ऑडियंस की तरफ जाऊँगा।
तो ethnicity पे तो अब where I would be able to speak from better on that question is from Karachi, right? I'm from Karachi, so thoda bahut I can speak to the politics of ethnicity and how it shaped judgments from that perspective, right? And I think ek to ye hai ki the division between like the Sindhi and non-Sindhi groups within the bar in Karachi and within the bench in Karachi is very significant, right? And it's an important part of politics there. And I think very often what you also see is that there'll be a sense that hamari jo Sindhi judges or whatever will be in Karachi, this would be the sentiment by and large कि ये PPP के लोग होंगे, PPP judges होंगे, and they will be, and that is how they will be viewed or understood, right? And often there will be non-Sindhi judges. Now, I'm not trying to cast a broader thing, but I think there is a politics about, particularly within Karachi, within the Sindh High Court and in the Supreme Court, about sort of pushing back against PPP, right? And there's automatically thinking कि PPP जो है ये एक ethnic card खेलते हैं, वो अपने particular Sindhi group को favor करते हैं, and they favor the that part of Sindh against Karachi, against non-Sindhis in Karachi, etc. And that shapes the way these judges who come from that thinking will approach the jurisprudence, right? So, for example, I think Chief Justice Gulzar jo the, right? He was very much a long-standing challenger of the PPP, right? And a lot of his jurisprudence is shaped by this idea that a lot of his suo motu cases, etc., that PPP jo hai na, they are the source. PPP and the people they bring from different parts outside Karachi, etc., are the source of the problems within Karachi, right? And so literally you see his jurisprudence from the get-go, right? He starts off back in the NRO case ke time mein. He's just joined the Supreme Court, and Iftikhar Chaudhary puts him right up front to on the benches to constantly go after and hound the PPP, because he knows this guy, he will just go after PPP, right? And that's his whole career from there on, right? As Chief Justice, it's really focused on the PPP. Now, you can see a particular politics thing, but what's really interesting there, why I bring him in, not because of his ethnicity, I think, but because when he starts these cases about Karachi's management, right? Particularly ये जो ये नस्ला टावर्स और ये सारा वो encroachment के cases जो चल रहे थे, right? Initially, he has whichever judges he wants. You have Sajjad Ali Shah, the Karachi judge, on the bench. But as time passes by, less and less of the Sindh judges want to be on his suo motu bench. So it's like this endless omnibus litigation, right? Where he goes on and on, jo Karachi ke sare masle masail hain, we will hear them on this one bench, right? And so he starts off with having other Karachi-based judges on the bench. But later on, as his positions get more and more intense, and the kind of solutions he's trying to produce are more and more like blowing up Nasta Tower, etc., significant, he surrounds himself with more judges who are not from Sindh, right? Because he finds that more useful, because those judges are thinking, yeah, we have to go back to Karachi. Log kya kahenge, about us, that we were part of this enterprise, right? And so a Punjab judge would be less worried about that, so they might be more willing to accommodate that, and work with him on that, right? So I think that was one interesting thing to see, where how that particular targeting of Sindh and Karachi and PPP that Gulzar did required at some point judges from outside Sindh to support it, because at some point, even within Sindh, the judge was like, we have to go back to Karachi, and this is a little difficult place to be. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Yeah. So we have Ehtisham Sahab, Dera Ismail Khan to ne बहुत active politics से हिस्सा लेंदे ने उथे, तो मेरे बहुत सारे differences ने, लेकिन एहतिशाम हमेशा हाजिर होंदे ने, दसदे ने. Please.
So I have two questions. Number one, you said that lawyers come from urban class, and then they see elite as their enemy, the thing that you said. So on this I want to ask, is it just about lawyers or judiciary, or in Pakistan as society as a whole, the urban middle class? It's too frustrated when you see it in PTI, politicians, political supporters. in judiciary, anywhere, media, anywhere? Is it just, in judiciary, or is in the society as a whole? Number one. Number two, one other aspect that I think is very important, and it's evolving in judiciary is, and war politics is, arrival of extremist elements, and they are getting more traction, like TLP. TLP has. I am not a law person, but I can't reconcile how can a person support, beheading of anyone who, उसकी जो भी interpretation है उससे, and at the same time be a lawyer. And this is getting traction, and they are getting, अभी जो बार के election है उसमें काफी support followers and all that, and they are very popular on social media as well. So how do you see those?
That's really interesting. So on the question of the so you were saying on the TLP and all this, the second question, right? I thought that, so first of all, I'd be really interested to know more about how much the TLP has been engaged. So let me connect both questions actually. So first, thinking about this, it being a broader phenomenon, right? I completely agree. It is this broader urban middle class frustration with their inability to sort of, see the state run and operate the way they would prefer it, right? And have a greater say and role and stake in the way the state is run and managed and governance is done, right? I think that is definitely there that is definitely symptomatic of the urban middle class as a whole. I think that the thing is that's why the thing with the, there's a bit of an echo. Is it okay now? It's okay, no problem. I think the thing is that for the judiciary, for the bar, it's the idea that perfect. The perfect way to resolve, like to tackle this frustration, is that they have this particular institution that they are connected to, through which they can then lay claim, which is the judiciary, right? And it's particularly shaped by that idea, because the judiciary can represent us better than other institutions can. It should be the institution that plays a bigger role in our politics, right? And in many ways, that's why I said that the law movement is in some ways like a proto-PTI for that reason. Not entirely, but in some parts of it, right? Because that sentiment is so well echoed and then spread out writ large by the PTI, and representing of that sort of echoes that politics and resonates with it. But the second question, I think in some ways is also connected to that, right? Because, okay, so with TLP, now you mentioned beheadings, you can't believe how beheadings are. But if you see when the TLP or these parties put forward, they will say, they are saying, we are upholding our law, right? Our law and our institutions are not committing to the fight against whatever particular principles of religion we need them to uphold, and that our law tells us we must uphold, right? Our constitution tells us we must. So we must do these things ourselves in service of the law. So it is again still this idea about how do you want to develop the rule of law, right? What is the rule of law? The rule of law to you is that the law as it is, those who have wronged must be held accountable. That is how it is understood in this very simplistic term. Now, whether that is Nawaz Sharif in Panama, or it is someone who's committed, said something again, sort of religiously problematic or controversial, it's the same sentiment. The law demands we do everything we can, including going beyond the law, to serve the law, right? And that is what I mean by a sort of idea of rule of law populism, which is very popular in a state that feels that, one, our elites don't represent us, etc., and our systems and the rules of our system don't allow us to truly realize what we think justice is, right? And I think it's really interesting you mentioned TLP. Now, I'd love to know more about which bars TLP has become more and more prominent, because I'm sure it has. I'd be interested to know if it's also the city bars versus the high court bars, or both, right? Because it would be interesting to know that, again, the class dynamics, right? And how city bar class dynamics differ from high court bar class dynamics. And when you also talk then to people who, a lot of the conversation I've had about like lawyers in sort of some of the city bars, it's like, what draws you to become a lawyer, right? And for some of them, at least, and not to make a generalization, but quite a few, it is, what does the Kala court represent, right? And it is कि हम जहाँ से आते हैं, where we've been, where we've come from, whatever, we deal with like the police constantly. police do this with police بڑے بدماش ہوتے ہیں, police ہمارے ساتھ یہ کرتے ہیں وہ کرتے ہیں. جب یہ when we wear the coat police ڈرتے ہیں, right? It's this idea کہ we can push back against the state when we wear the coat, right? We have a status when we wear the coat, and we have a significance that, you know, we can be badmash back. Yeah. We can be and we can resist in that way. So there's a lot of appeal. A lot of this, the reason people are becoming lawyers is to push back against what they see as different state elites who they think have abused them, wronged them, hurt them, and wearing the coat is a way to push back against that, for better or for worse.
Interesting. By the way, وہ جڑے کچھ چند ایک بارز نے, وہ شیخوپورہ بار اور بیٹھے نے پٹی صاحب, گجرات بار خاص طور پہ بہت مشہور نے.
Well, you will know much more about this than I will.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk
So,
about
Bhatti Sahab is from Gujarat particularly. تو Bhatti Sahab خود بھی لائر نے جی بہت دیر تو تسی جڑی ایتھنیسٹی دی گل کیتی سی, اور سوری ذات برادری دی گل کیتی سی, وہ انہاں دے یہ بار بار جدوں بھی کسی جج دا نام لیندے نے دستے نے فلاں برادری تو ہیں, حالانکہ برادری دا چنڈا میں چکا ہے, لیکن یہ دس دے رہے نے تو آج میں ایسوسیٹ کر سکیا. جی بھٹی صاحب, شراز بھٹی صاحب.
بڑی مثبت باتیں سننے کو ملی ہیں, بہت خوشی ہوئی. آپ نے ایک تو یہ جو سیپنگ سپریمیسی کے عنوان سے جو کتاب کا جو حوالہ دیا اور ساری ڈیٹیل لکھی ہے اس میں, یہ بھی خوشی کی پڑھی. آپ نے سارے ججمنٹس پڑھی ہیں, فیصلہ جات پڑھے ہیں, مولوی تقی الدین کیس بھی پڑھا ہوگا, ڈاکٹر جسٹس منیر کا بھی تذکرہ کیا ہوگا اس میں لازمی طور پہ. وہاں سے لے کے پھر ضیاء الحق اور پرویز مشرف اور لائرز موومنٹ کا آپ نے حوالہ دیا. اور میڈم نے ایک سوال کیا کہ یہ بغلا چاہتے کیا ہے, بڑا اچھا لگا سوال. میں سے مطلب ایک تو اس کو سوال بھی سمجھ لیں اور ایک تجویز بھی سمجھ لیں کہ ہم چاہتے ہیں, باتیں ساری ہو چکی ہیں, صرف جو ہے نا تھوڑا سا میں ایک آپ کی اجازت سے باتیں کرنی کہ چاہتے تو ہم وہی ہیں, رول آف لا چاہتے ہیں جو بھی آپ نے بیان کیا, اور آئین کی بالادستی چاہتے ہیں. لیکن ہم یہ بھول جاتے ہیں سب لوگ جب بھی یہ ایسے واقعات ہوتے ہیں جیسے 8 فروری کے الیکشن میں ہوا ہے, فارم 45 اور 47 کی گورنمنٹ بیٹھی ہوئی ہے اس وقت, یہ باتیں کھل کے کرنی چاہیے. اور ہر دفعہ انہی وجوہات کی وجہ سے, آپ کو پتہ ہے جب ایوب خان نے تختہ الٹا اور 11 سال وہ صاحب اقتدار میں رہے, پھر یحییٰ خان صاحب آئے, تو ان کی وجہ سے, خدائیوں کی وجہ سے ملک دولت ہو گیا. اور میں کسی سیاستدان کو ذمہ دار نہیں ٹھہراتا کیونکہ ان کا قصور نہیں تھا. جنہوں نے الیکشن کروایا تھا انہوں نے اتھارٹی جو ہے وہ شفٹ کر دی. یحییٰ خان اگر اقتدار میں تھے نا 91 میں الیکشن انہوں نے کروایا, ان کی ذمہ داری تھی کہ وہ اقتدار ذمہ داروں کو دیتے جو اکثریت میں تھے. اس وقت زیادتی ہوئی, پھر ضیاء الحق صاحب آ گئے, انہوں نے ذوالفقار علی بھٹو صاحب کو تختہ الٹا. آئین جو دیا جنہوں نے 1973 کے آئین کی آپ بات کرتے ہیں, آئین ہمیں انہوں نے دیے. میں کسی پارٹی کا, پیپلز پارٹی کا یا پی ٹی آئی کا کوئی ترجمان نہیں ہوں, نہ پی ٹی آئی کا, لیکن اب ایک جماعت آئی ہے, یہ پی ٹی آئی بڑا تذکرہ کیا کہ جی بڑی اکثریت تھی اور ان کا, ان کو ایک صاحب جیل میں بیٹھے ہیں, قیدی نمبر 804. مطلب وہ دیکھ لیں آپ, یہ انہوں نے باز نہیں آنا, یہ جو وردی والے لوگ ہیں نا, انہوں نے مداخلت کرتے رہنا ہے. آپ جیسے لوگ تبصرہ کرتے رہیں گے, کتابیں لکھتے رہیں گے, یہ کتابیں لائبریریوں کی زینت بنیں گی, ہمارے وکلا کی لائبریریوں کی زینت بنیں گی. تو یہ یا تو ان کا احتساب کون کرے گا؟ آرٹیکل 6 آپ نے پڑھا ہی ہوگا.
جی بٹ صاحب بہت شکریہ, تو سب بہت بڑھیا تجویز دیتی ہے. ان
کا بھی احتساب ہونا چاہیے, ان کو پوچھے کوئی. یہ تو نہیں جب یہ بندوق لہرا کے چھڑی گردن پہ رکھ کے تو آپ کو کہیں چلیں گے آپ گھر جائیں, کوئی اور آ جائے. میں یہ نہیں کہتا کہ بھٹو صاحب کو کون لایا, سارے ادھر سے ہی آتے ہیں. آشیرواد جس کو ہوتی ہے نا تو وہ پھر اقتدار میں بیٹھ جاتا ہے, جب اقتدار مل جاتا ہے تو وہ ان کا تھوڑا سا
میں
آئی تھنک میں صرف ایک انٹرونشن یا کرنا چاہوں گی کہ اسکالر کا رول کیا ہے سوسائٹی میں. آئی تھنک اس کے بارے میں بہت زیادہ کنفیوژن ہے کہ آپ صرف کتاب لکھ رہے ہیں, آپ کوئی اور تبدیلی نہیں لا رہے, آپ صرف تحقیق کر رہے ہیں, آپ کے کام کی اور کوئی ریئل لائف امپورٹنس نہیں ہے. اس پہ آپ کچھ ریئیکٹ کرنا چاہیں گے؟ آئی تھنک اٹس اے گڈ مومنٹ. اگر
میں سوچ رہا ہوں کہ what's the best answer. دیکھیں the point of like a book like this. एक तो आप सही कह रहे हैं कि academic की जो किताबें ज़्यादातर लोग पढ़ते भी नहीं हैं, they remain in libraries. In fact, I remember the first time I had a book launch, someone said कोई नहीं पढ़ेगा आपका किताब, right? That was literally told to me on my book, like first book launch, right? Because that is the reality of academic work in Pakistan, right? मगर ये फिर जिम्मेदार इसमें कौन है, right? That is also on those who choose not to read these books or leave them in libraries, right? Because I would say, while just Maryam was saying about the role of like scholars in society, so now my book obviously could do much more, could be much. There are many ways I could do more in society than write this book. But the book's point is कि आप बताएं कि किस तरह से courts can push, when can courts push back more against the military, right? तो आप पूछ रहे हैं कि इनकी एहतसाब कैसे होगी, right? ऐसे नहीं है कि पाकिस्तान में कभी एहतसाब नहीं हुए, राइट, मिलिट्री की. देयर बी डिफरेंट वेज, इन लिमिटेड वेज, इन व्हिच देयर हैज बीन सम challenges accountability of the military, right? Now, it's never been ideal, it's never been everything we want to be, but a book like this maybe can tell us a little bit about that history, about the ways, the moments in which we've been able to challenge the military, the hegemony of the military in different ways. So इससे हम सीखते हैं, अच्छा इस मोमेंट में ये जैसे अब लेट 70s में अगर ये फखरुद्दीन इब्राहिम वगैरह ने कुछ डिसीजन बनाए थे मिलिट्री जिया के खिलाफ, क्यों बनाए थे, कैसे बनाए थे, क्या हुआ था उस टाइम में, राइट? या आप चलो इफ्तिखार चौधरी के टाइम में अगर कुछ जजों ने ये पोजीशन ली थी मिलिट्री के खिलाफ, ये क्यों हुआ, कैसे हुआ, कब हुआ, राइट? तो अगर हम अब बैठे हुए हैं, वी आर थिंकिंग ओके हाउ डू वी नाउ in the future, in our current world, think about कि हम एहतसाब कैसे करें. The role of scholars is maybe to inform us of that history, of those moments, of those conditions, and of those strategies that we have used in the past at different points to deal with these challenges in the future. तो अब जो है, अगर हम बैठे हुए अब देखें, जैसे आपने कहा, I mean, just look right now, जे जो हो रहा है, आपने one of the most interesting things to me is to watch PTI में कितनी जल्दी से वकालत सामने आ गए हैं to surround Imran Khan, right? Barrister Gohar आ गए हैं, Barrister Saif आ गए हैं, sorry, सलमान अकरम राजा साहब आ गए हैं, right? अब ये आखिरी में फिर भी prominent role, right? अब क्यों, right? ये कोई पहली दफा तो नहीं हुए, ये हर दफा होती है जब party is being captured, being targeted by the state. There's a lawyers are always the most useful constituency in the party to push back. Now, if we want to understand, now that's something we know because we've been studying this, right? चाहे PMLN के time पे, चाहे PPP के time पे, in the late 70s, early 80s, there's always an important role of lawyers in the party because एक तो lawyers don't get arrested as easily as everyone else does because, as we said, now lawyers can push back a bit. दूसरी बात है कि lawyers will be involved in the litigation. जो भी cases होंगे, हमारे ये होते हैं कि law fair जो चलती है, इसके ये केस, वो केस, 1000 केस लगा दें, ऐसे दिस इज आवर हिस्ट्री. जो भी पॉलिटिकल अपोनेंट्स हुए उनके खिलाफ 1000 केसेस होते हैं, तो 1000 लॉयर्स होते हैं जो केसेस लड़ते हैं, एंड दैट्स हाउ आवर पॉलिटिक्स इज फॉट इन दिस पीरियड्स ऑफ रिप्रेशन, राइट? So if we want to understand how we manage these moments, we need to understand why this happens every time, and then how do lawyers become critically important in these moments of repression, of authoritarian repression, and what they can do to push back against the state, right? So that's I think where our work like Dr. Khan's, like mine, can come into place because हम ये बता सकते हैं कि जब ये हुआ है, lawyers ने क्या role अदा किया है, क्या किरदार अदा किया है, and how can they use these moments best to push back, right? And if we don't study that history, फिर हम ये हर दफा बैठेंगे, ये तो कभी नहीं हुआ हमारी सियासत में. Everything has happened in our siyasat, right? And everything we can possibly imagine has happened in our siyasat. And if we learn from each of those moments what happened, we know how better to fight it next time, right? And even now, I think we are better equipped to fight some of this repression than we were 20 years ago. So I think that is the scholar.
जी एक मिनट ताहिर साहब, थैंक यू. ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਮੌਜੂਦ ਨੇ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਤੋਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਗੈਸਟ ਗੁਰਸ਼ਮਸ਼ੀਰ ਸਿੰਘ. ਹੀ ਹੈਜ਼ ਬੀਨ ਪ੍ਰੈਕਟਿਸਿੰਗ ਇਨ ਚੰਡੀਗੜ੍ਹ ਕੋਰਟ, ਆਈ ਗੈਸ हाँ चंडीगढ़. तो गुरशमशीर इज़ अ गेस्ट हेयर, बज़म-ए-आलम ਦੇ ਮਹਿਮਾਨ ਦੇ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਪਾਕਿਸਤਾਨ ਮੌਜੂਦ ਨੇ. ਸੋ ਮੈਂ ਚਾਹਾਂਗਾ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਕੀ ਤਾਸੁਰਾਤ ਨੇ ਇਸ ਸਵਾਲ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਉਹ ਪੁੱਛਣ. So you have to represent the whole India now. ठीक है.
It's an insightful discussion, first of all. ਤਾਂ ਇੱਕ ਤਾਂ ਵਾਰਿਸ ਸ਼ਾਹ ਨੇ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਸੀ ਵੀ ਜੱਜਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਉਸ ਟਾਈਮ ਤੇ, ਹੈ ਨਾ. ਮੈਂ ਪੁੱਛਣਾ ਚਾਹੂੰਗਾ ਕਿ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਕੁਝ ਬਦਲਿਆ ਹੈ? ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਵੀ ਖਾਣ ਵੱਡੀਆਂ ਨਿਤ ਇਮਾਨ ਵੇਚਣ, ਇਹ ਮਾਰ ਹੈ ਕਾਜ਼ੀਆਂ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ। ਤਾਂ ਇਹ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਪਾਕਿਸਤਾਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾਂ ਇੰਡੀਅਨ ਸਬ ਕੰਟੀਨੈਂਟ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਦ ਕਰਪਸ਼ਨ ਇਨ ਜੁਡੀਸ਼ਰੀ ਕਿੰਨਾ ਕੁ ਵੱਡਾ ਮਸਲਾ? ਦੂਸਰਾ ਮੇਰਾ ਸਵਾਲ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਨ ਇੰਡੀਆ we have a constitutional history, we have the entire process of the constitutional building. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, you have the different trajectory. And in that process, when you make a comparative study of the Indian constitutional law, and we have the particular movements, we have the movement when a judge can topple a sitting prime minister, and that's Indira Gandhi, the Rajiv Khanna case, and then you have the basic doctrine case, the basic structure theory, and then we have Indira Sani judgment and the reservation in caste and many law movements also, Ayodhya judgment and all. And you have your own trajectory. And when you compare both as a constitutional journey of India and of Pakistan, how you compare and how you place both the journeys. And my question, the part of it, this question, extension, is since Pakistan is built on Islam, on a religion, and the state on the religion, and when as a socio-legal scholar of Pakistani law, you place yourself to the international audience, where you feel challenges or privileges, and how the Pakistani law is any way the Pakistani law is contributing to the jurisprudence of subcontinent and the world in general.
So very interesting. काफी सवाल है, बहुत interesting सवाल है. I want to start with the last one actually because it reminded me something. आपने कहा कि पाकिस्तान की jurisprudence, what has it been sort of history, and I think one of the most interesting कि वो state versus Doso decision जो आई थी, the one that legitimizes Ayub Khan's coup, has actually had quite a precedent in other countries for other coups as well. Revolutionary legal. So it's the wrong kind of precedent, but we have definitely had that precedent. Just I think Rhodesia में the state versus Doso is cited, and then a bunch of other countries. You've seen हमारी जो military coup, जैसे military coups को जिस तरह legitimize किया गया है, that doctrine has traveled to quite a few other authoritarian states as well. So that's not the right kind of legacy, but it's one we have, right? I think the reason, on the other hand, I think, so when you said about, so the first question you had about was corruption, right? I mean, corruption is a huge problem, right, in the Pakistani judicial system. First of all, there's two tiers to the judicial system, right? Those are the lower courts, city courts, district and sessions courts. There's a whole particular kind of corruption at that level of the courts, largely also because these are judges who are really not making, dealing with huge backlogs, not getting the kind of financial compensation they get for their role is also minimal. So there's all kinds of opportunities for rent seeking and corruption and motivations for it at that lower court level. But at the high court level, the Supreme Court level, absolutely also, right? So one of the ways in which judges get co-opted, right, by the military, by political parties, by others, is by financial favors and financial benefits, or by being told that we know about your corruption, right? So corruption is something that makes a judge either pliable or to the interest of the military, or it makes them pliable either because they'll work with the military in exchange for financial favor, or the military knows about their corruption and will use it against them and say, we'll expose it and ruin your reputation if you don't toe our line, right? And the military, political parties all do that kind of thing. So that is a real problem, right? The vulnerabilities it creates in your High Court and Supreme Court judges to manipulation, right? And undermining the independence of the judiciary. On the comparative story, I think that's a really interesting point, one we have to think about a lot. But one thing I will say is, तो आपकी भी sitting prime ministers भी निकाले गए, हमारे भी sitting prime ministers भी निकाले गए. This is, we are one in this, unfortunate legacy. But what also I think is, this is something I feel more broadly in the social science, कि हमारा जो पिछला history, the previous history of the last 50 to 60 years has always been told in social sciences कि आप इंडिया को देखें और आप पाकिस्तान को देखें, right? India is the great democratic story, Pakistan is the great authoritarian tragedy, right? And now that's not the story anymore. Pakistan is still an authoritarian tragedy, But India has become a big question mark as well, right? The rise of the BJP, the rise of, the sort of increasing growing authoritarianism under the BJP and Hindutva has been a real threat to any kind of liberal constitutional pretenses or ideas that we think the Indian political system upheld. And I think in this is what's really interesting now is to study, and for us to all study, is how in these moments of comparative authoritarian power, how differently do courts get captured and how do they behave? So this is a really good time now to study them, because before it was something with this is the success story, this is the failure, right? Now we have two stories that can really be told in a more meaningful comparison. And I think the real interesting part of that story is in India you have your authoritarian actor is the BJP, a powerful political party. At Pakistan it's the military, right? And I think a powerful political party is more equipped to capture the courts than the one of us. So I think the courts in India are more vulnerable to capture by the BJP than even the courts here are, and for the reason that we were discussing earlier. BJP can produce its own judges. BJP can produce its own lawyers, its own bar. The military can't do that, right? It doesn't have that same kind of thing. And that creates a greater danger of capture and control of the judiciary in some ways. And so it's really interesting to see how that will play out now in India. And I think that's the story we need to be talking about and comparing over the next 2 to 3 years. Or it's following a similar story, and we have to see how it plays out differently with a political party in power and as the dominant actor versus this sort of military-civilian alliance we have in Pakistan. What we can learn from that, I think, who is better equipped to capture and control the judiciary? It's not a competition that we want to win, but it's a competition we want to observe and what we will learn from.
Don't tell this in India being a
jurisprudence question.
So the jurisprudence, as in what has emerged from our jurisprudence? So one of them is that we have produced plenty of jurisprudence that other authoritarian states have found very useful. I think one of the bigger problems is how does jurisprudence really get noticed abroad, right? It's not by reading judgments, right? The people abroad aren't sitting and reading. It's about the scholarship, right? So do scholars talk about their country's legal judgments? Do they get an international audience, etc.? Like you were asking about being a Pakistani, how are you taken by international audiences? And I think that's a really interesting thought. Now, I don't think personally I have had to be specifically labeled in because of the fact that I'm coming from Pakistan with its Islamic background as a scholar, as a legal thinker who is informed by that. But that's also because I've had, we have elite privilege. I've been abroad for quite a few years, etc. So I don't think that baggage has been a problem for me. But what has been is the fact that Pakistan isn't considered a very serious producer of constitutional precedents that the rest of the world should consider. And that is because of the lack of legal academia and legal scholarship talking about Pakistan, producing scholarship within Pakistan, and scholarship that then goes abroad. So this is to the point we were discussing earlier. This is one of the limitations. If this is an entirely practitioner-oriented profession in Pakistan, it just, law schools are run by vakils, the judiciary is run by vakils, the books are written by vakils, right? That then, operators are written by vakils. That then means that there is no scholarship that the rest of the world can read about Pakistan and learn from Pakistan, right? So India has a vibrant legal academia, and legal scholars are very highly respected in India, right? Whatever the politics of the state, there's a very high level of respect for the legal academia, right? And they also pay much better than I ever expected. Actually, I learned recently. So that's also great, right? That's why there's a voice for them abroad, because that's what people abroad are reading, right? They're reading the scholarship about the Indian court, and it's amazing how, and therefore India has this, and that's why Pakistan, I don't think, has been able to influence precedents in that way abroad, because it doesn't have scholars talking about Pakistan in an analytically useful way.
I will just ask 2 questions. The last 2 more questions, please. ਤੁਸੀਂ ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਪੁੱਛ ਲੈਣਾ ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ.
तमाम वकला भाई मेरे लिए बहुत काबिल एहतराम है। चौधरी इफ्तिकार के दौर में जाते हैं, एजुकेशन हुआ, वकला सामने आया, आपको पता है, गवर्नमेंट भी इन्वॉल्व हुई, इस्टेब्लिशमेंट भी इन्वॉल्व हुई। उसके बाद वकला का बड़ा अग्रेसिव रोल सामने आया, पुलिस वालों से लड़ाई, जजिस से लड़ाई, कार्डियोलॉजी का वाक़या बयान नहीं किया जा सकता। क्या ऐसी मुदाखलत अदारों की, सियासतदानों की, एग्रेसिव एटीट्यूड, जो लोग एक इंसाफ की आस लगाए बैठे होते हैं, उस मुआशरे पर क्या असरअंदाज होता है, अवाम पे क्या असरअंदाज होता है, और जो कंसर्न लोग होते हैं उनकी रैबो पे क्या अंदाज़?
Hello, my question is it possible that there could be a shift of audience when a person is a judge of the Supreme Court? I mean, he's a senior punitive judge or a junior judge, and when he becomes a chief justice, I mean, you can look at the brilliant case of Qazi Faiz. He was something else when he was a senior punitive judge, but I don't know what he became of when he became a CJ. And second question, ke post Al Jihad Trust case, when you talk to the lawyers or judges about the elevation of judges to Supreme Court, was there any mention that why is there little to no elevation of women in the high courts? I mean, of course, we are inherently patriarchal, but why were there no women elevated to the high courts?
थैंक यू आई गेस पहला ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਵਾਲ ਹੈ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਥੋੜਾ ਲੇਟ ਆਏ ਹੋ ਆਲਰੇਡੀ ਜਵਾਬ ਦੇ ਚੁੱਕੇ ਨੇ बट योर कॉल एंड देन विल जस्ट वाइंड इट अप थैंक यू वेरी मच
थैंक यू फॉर द क्वेश्चन। तो आप पूछ रहे थे कि ये जो वकीलों की मुदाखलत है इनटू द सिस्टम, व्हाट इज दैट डन? आई मीन आई थिंक कि इसमें देयर इज नो डाउट कि जैसे वो व्हेन द लॉयर्स अटैक द कोर्ट्स, जैसे वो वकलागर्दी जो होती है, राइट, दैट इज वेरी प्रॉब्लमैटिक एंड it is very disruptive, right? मसला ये, I think the thing is कि I don't think it's going to go anywhere, right? क्योंकि it's also very politically useful. तो जो भी institutions हैं, इदारे हैं, they rely on the badmashi of the वकील. The badmashi of the वकील is a very useful political resource in Pakistan, right? चाहे आप अदालत हो, like you couldn't have had the lawyers movement में यही लोग कहते हैं कि it wasn't just the, you know, कि वो the front men, Ehtizaz Saab, Hamid Saab, whatever, who was standing there tall for judiciary and constitution. It was the badmash, right? It was the lawyers who were there rallying, marching, burning vehicles, whatever. That's what really scares the powers that be. It's the fact that lawyers में ये है कि आप एक ताली पे you can call out hundreds of lawyers onto the street because it's a ready-made cadre of mobilized agitators, right? And the more agitation they can do, the जितना वो बुकलागर्दी कर सकते हैं, जितना बदमाशी वो कर सकते हैं, the more effective your political campaign is, right? And that is politics in Pakistan requires and relies, from whether we like it or not, on a certain level of that kind of badmashi, right? That kind of action. So that's why it's politically safe for the political parties. They need them to do this kind of thing. So ये कहीं नहीं जाने वाला, and it's not because of the lawyers, it's because that is what our system uses the lawyers for and needs lawyers for in many ways, right? And that's what makes them particularly an interesting part of our politics. And ऐसे ही रहेगा, I think, for a long time. I don't want to make predictions, but I wouldn't think it's going to change anytime soon. On the question on the politics of the you asked first about how did the audiences change? Absolutely, they change. I'm trying to remember a quote. I think I have it in the book, but one judge explained to me, they're like, when you're a high court judge, your first few years, your audience is both the lawyers in your courtroom and your some of your senior judges, right? When you are a senior judge in the high courts, particularly if you're thinking about elevation, your audience is just the Supreme Court, right? You're just thinking, High Court Chief Justice kya soch rahe, Supreme Court kya soch rahe, right? So you kind of, but once you become a Supreme Court judge, particularly as you go up the ranks, again you start thinking about the other communities outside, so the reputation, because you're a public figure now, right? So there's the way the media talks about you, there's the way the channels talk about you, there's the way the lawyers talk about you on those channels, right? And so on and so forth, and the way the politicians talk about you as well, right? And I think that, so I think it changes from, because what happens is when you're a new judge or a young judge, आपकी एक तो probation period होती है, दूसरी if lawyers don't like you, वो High Court Chief Justice को बताते हैं ये जो बंदा है निकाल दो इससे, right? फारिग कर दो, right? And that can happen, right? And it has happened, right? So they don't get confirmed, basically. But once you move up, then the judges become more important. But then once you're a Supreme Court judge, and particularly the Chief Justice, Senior Puni, etc., they are especially concerned with what the public, like broader constituencies beyond the courts think about them. So you're asking, how did that change? And you mentioned Qazi Faiz there. I think one of the most interesting things you've seen, and this has only happened from senior puny judges and chief justices, is the letters, right? This new thing of writing letters that go public, right? It's such an, it's a very clearly political tool that these judges are trying to get their point of view out to constituencies beyond the court. And if you look at it, it's always been a senior deputy judge and a chief justice, or at most the number 3 who write these letters, right? Because that's the way these different senior figures who are dealing with each other are utilizing and speaking to the audiences whose support they need in the fights they're having, right? And I think that's really interesting to see. Therefore, if you think about how these letters are written, who they think, you can see how much the judges care about audiences over time. And Qazi Faizisa clearly cared about audiences, different audiences when he was fighting the establishment versus whether he took different sides, right? Munib Akhtar, Mansoor Ali Shah, Abandiyal, they all wrote letters, right? And in each of them, we look at, okay, what are they saying? Who are they speaking to? So there'll be a next study, I think, on letters by judges, because it's become such a popular new tool, and studying who they speak to, why they choose to make the choices they do in those letters will be something we need to study alongside our jurisprudence increasingly. Yeah.
Thank you.
And on the question on women, so I mean, my obvious answer would be that when you have a system that keeps where the judges keep choosing judges, right? You have a system that keeps reproducing itself, right? Like, and so if it's male judges, then they'll just reproduce the same thing. Like, I think I once asked a judge, what's the best way to become a judge? And he said, either be the son of a judge or married to the daughter of a judge. And no point is to be the daughter of the judge, because again, it's a system that reproduces itself consistently, right? And I think when you have a system of appointments that is built around such a system without any criteria, without any representation requirements, and where the same people get to choose again and again, you'll keep reproducing the same look. I think that's my thought on it.
Thank you.
This is new, right? But this
जी.
is sort of, he was saying over our history since Al Jihad, this is a new thing, thankfully.
So thank you जी. मैं जी मैं डॉक्टर साहब ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ ਅਦਾ ਕਰਦਾ, ਮੈਂ ਆਈਡੀਆਜ਼ ਦਾ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ ਅਦਾ ਕਰਦਾ ਇਸ ਬੁੱਕ ਟਾਕ ਨੂੰ ਔਰ ਇਸ ਸੀਰੀਜ਼ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਇਨਾ ਐਫੀਸ਼ੀਐਂਟਲੀ ਚੱਲਣ ਵਾਸਤੇ, ਔਰ ਮੈਂ ਆਪ ਆਡੀਅנס ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਸ਼ੁਕਰਗੁਜ਼ਾਰ ਹਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਏ। ਅੱਛਾ, ਸੋ ਨੈਕਸਟ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਚੁੱਕੇ ਸਿੰਸ ਇਸ ਦਾ ਬੁੱਕ ਟਾਕ ਸੀਰੀਜ਼ ਬਜ਼ਮ-e-Alam ਆਈਡੀਆਜ਼ ਔਰ ਹਸਤੋ-ਨੀਸਤ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਮਿਲ ਕੇ, our next book will be in March, hopefully, inshallah. Or that book is about the ethnic politics emerging, particularly in Sindh. बहुत ही senior साडे academic ने, or she teaches at LUMS, so she will be talking about it, that book. चलो, Asma Faiz, Professor Asma Faiz. So उस book talk वास्ते लाजमी आना जी, और thank you very much once again, डॉक्टर साहब आपका बहुत
Thank you for organizing. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.